This document was supplied for free educational purposes. Unless it is in the public domain, it may not be sold for profit or hosted on a web server without the permission of the copyright holder. If you find it of help to you and would like to support the Ministry of Theology on the web, please consider using the links below, https://www.bemiacoffee.com/theology, PayPal, https://patreon.com/theologyonthuabe, https://paypal.me/RobRadshaw. Translations of Early Documents Series 2 Hellenistic Jewish Texts, The Letter of Aristeas, The Letter of Aris 1 EAS, translated with an appendix of ancient evidence on the origin of the Septuagint by H. Sister J. Thackeray, M.A. Grinfield, lecturer on the Septuagint in the University O.J. Oxford Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, London, 68, Haymarket, SWR, New York, The Macmillan Company, 1918. First edition, R9 R7. Editor's preface. The object of this series of translations is primarily to furnish students with short, cheap, and handy textbooks, which, it is hoped, will facilitate the study of the particular texts in class under competent teachers. But it is also hoped that the volumes will be acceptable to the general reader who may be interested in the subjects with which they deal. It has been thought advisable, as a general rule, to restrict the notes and comments to a small compass, more especially as, in MOT cases, excellent works of a more elaborate character are available. Indeed, it is much to be desired that these translations may have the effect of inducing readers to study the larger works. Our principal aim, in a word, is to make some difficult texts, important for the study of Christian origins, more generally accessible in faithful and scholarly translations. In most cases these texts are not available in a cheap and handy form. In one or two cases texts have been included of books which are available in the official Apocrypha, but in every such case reasons exist for putting forth these texts in a new translation, with an introduction, in this series. W0. E0 Esther Lee. G.H. Box. V. Introduction. Contents. The document known as the Letter of Aristeas purports to be a contemporary record, by a Greek holding a high position at the court of Ptolemy Philadelphus, 285,247 LLC, of the translation of the Hebrew Pentateuch into Greek, undertaken at the instance of the royal librarian, Demetrius of Phalerum. The familiar name the Septuagint, by which the Greek Old Testament as a whole came to be known, owes its origin to the story here told of the 72 translators of the law. The narrative is communicated in the form of a letter from Aristeas to his brother Philocrates. Aristeas claims to have been a member of the embassy sent from Alexandria to Jerusalem to obtain a copy of the law and the services of a company of Palestinian translators. The letter is discursive, ranging over a variety of topics, the description of the actual work of translation being compressed into the closing sections. The following is an analysis of the contents. I. Introductory address to Philocrates, R8. 2. The origin of the scheme and preliminary proceedings, 9-51. A. The proposal of the king's librarian, 9-11. B. The emancipation of the Jewish slaves in Egypt, U27. 7-8. Introduction. C. The librarian's memorial, 28-33. D. The correspondence between Ptolemy and Eleazar, with the names of the translators, 34-51. 2. I. Description of the royal presents to Eleazar, 51-82. 4. Description of Jerusalem and its vicinity, 83-120. A. The temple, entrance, veil, altar, 84-87. B. The temple water supply, 88-91. C. The priests aired the public services, 92-95. D. The high priest's vestments, 96-99. E. The citadel and its guards, 100-104. Slash. The city and its streets, 105-106. G. Small and large cities, Jerusalem and Alexandria contrasted, 107-1R1. H. The country and its produce, harbors, rivers, mountain ranges, 112-8. T. The mines of Arabia, U9-120. V. Eleazar's farewell to the translators 120 to 127. 6. Eleazar's apology for the Jewish law 128 to 171. 7. Reception of the translators at Alexandria, 172,181. 8. The 7 days banquet in honor of the translators, 182 to 186. 9. The wise answers of the translators to the king's hard questions, 187 to 300. X. The translation and its reception, 301 to 316. 11. The departure of the translators, 3R7-32R12. Concluding address to Philocrates, 322. Character, date, and credibility of the narrative that the letter is not what it professes to be. A contemporary record of a Greek who played a prominent introduction LX part in the actions described, has long been recognized. In various ways the writer betrays himself. He was not a contemporary of Ptolemy Philadelphus. On 2 occasions he momentarily forgets his RT jail and reveals the interval of time which has elapsed since the age of that monarch. He alludes to the scrupulous care with which all business used to be transacted by these kings, 28, as though he were looking back over an epoch of a long dynasty of Ptolemies. Again, he tells us that the arrangements made at the Alexandrian court for the entertainment of foreigners may still be seen to this day, 182. He is not a veracious historian. Where his references to historical characters and events are open to control, he is found guilty of anachronisms and inaccuracies. He represents Rius, who, as we learn from other sources, was banished from Alexandria early in the reign of Philadelphus, as the king's confidential friend and librarian, upon whose initiative the translation was undertaken. We have no other evidence that the philosopher Mendemus of Eretria, 201, ever visited Alexandria. In the allusion to a naval victory of Ptolemy over Antigonus Gonatas, 1 so, either a decisive defeat of the Egyptian navy at the Battle of Kos, c. 260 BC, has been transformed into a victory, or the reference is to an actual victory at Andros many years later, c. 245 BC, in either case there is anachronism, both battles having occurred long after the death of Demetrius. The statements with regard to Theopompus, 314, and Theodex, 316, are doubtless equally untrustworthy. The writer himself in one place anticipates the increased edibility with which his story will be received, and finds it necessary to appeal to the unimpeachable evidence of his authorities, 296 ff. X introduction finally, and this is the main count in the indictment. The whole tone of the book proclaims the writer to be a Jew and not, as he would have us believe, 16, a Greek. The apologetic tendency is manifest throughout. His main object is to commend and magnify the Jewish nation, with its laws and institutions, in the eyes of the Greek public for which he writes, by narrating the honor bestowed upon it by a Greek monarch and the praise accorded to Jewish wisdom by heathen philosophers, 200 f. 235. He is at pains to explain the absence of any mention of the Jewish law in the Greek historians and poets, 31312 ff. The apologetic tendency is most apparent in the long exposition given by E. Lizar of the natural, or inward, meaning of the law, 17:1, with regard to clean and unclean food, a section which is penned with the intention of satisfying a supposed widespread curiosity, R28, and counteracting fallacious and long-exploded views on the subject, 144. The book, in short, belongs to the fairly large class of works which Skier designates Jewish propaganda under a heathen mask. In Professor Andrews' words, it is not too much to say that the writer's one object is to demonstrate the supremacy of the Jewish people, the Jewish priesthood, the Jewish law, the Jewish philosophy and the Jewish Bible. On the other hand, criticism of the work has in recent years entered on a new phase, and in one direction has to some extent rehabilitated our author. As long ago as 1870, when the importance of the Egyptian papyri was not fully recognized and the recovered documents were few, Professor Lombroso wrote, one perhaps with some slight exaggeration, there is not a court title, an institution, recherches sur l'économie po, Idakida el Egypt sule Lagides, p. 13. Introduction 11. A law, a magistracy, an office, a technical term, a formula, a remarkable turn of language in this letter. There is no piece of evidence of Aristeas concerning the civil history of the epoch, which is not found registered in the papyri or the inscriptions and confirmed by them. This statement is, on the whole, borne out by the much larger collections of papyri now available, with this important reservation that the titles, formulas, etc., appear, in some instances at least, to be those of the later, not the earlier, Ptolemaic age. Thol, the phrase "if it be thy good pleasure," 3:2, where the pronoun is unrepresented in the Greek, is not found in the papyri before 163 BC, nor the use of the plural in the phrase "of the chief of the bodyguards," 40, before 148 NC. The author, it must be admitted, is thoroughly conversant with the technical and official language of Alexandria and the court, and it is probable that his interesting incidental allusions to Alexandrian life and customs are equally trustworthy. The measures taken to counteract the injury to agriculture, produced by migration from country to town, RN 9ff, the treatment of informers, 167, cf 25, the reception of foreign embassies, 182. In these matters the information which he supplies may be used to supplement, where it is not confirmed by, that furnished by the papyri. If the writer is at home in Alexandrian matters, what weight may be attached to his description of Palestine, 83 to 120. Quaint as may be his ideas on e.g. the course of the Jordan, R 17, his description of Jerusalem itself has the vivid touch of an eyewitness. Surely, we are inclined to say, this man was a spectator of the waving curtain or veil at the entrance of the temple, 86, and was given proof on the spot of the existence of the underground cisterns beneath and around the XLL introduction temple area, 89 to 91, of which we learn from other sources. Sir George Adam Smith, indeed, regards the letter as the work, perhaps about 200, of a Jewish writer, well acquainted with the city and the land. Standing upon the acre, this observer had the bulk of the town before him on the southwest and northwest hills, and his description, 105, is given with remarkable fidelity to their configuration. 1. The date here suggested, after Shur, is largely based on the picture presented in this section of the political position of Palestine and its relation to Egypt. The fortress of Jerusalem is still in possession of the Jews. Alexandrians are allowed to enter the country and its capital without molestation, and the Jewish people and their high priest appear as almost politically independent. Shur. This, according to Shur, presupposes the period before the conquest of Palestine by the Seleucid dynasty in 198 BC as the date of writing. This brings us to the question of date, as to which there is a considerable diversity of opinion. The letter was used by Josephus, and was almost certainly known to Philo, 3e Appendix, pages 96 ff. How much earlier is it? 3 dates have hitherto been proposed, r. about 200 BC, Skier, 2, about RNO BC, or more precisely between 96 and 63 BC and near the former date, Wendland, 3, more than a century later, under Tiberius or Caligula, Gratz, Woolrich. The last named date is certainly too late, and the arguments for bringing the work down to the imperial age. G. A supposed reference to the Roman delators, 167, are unconvincing. The description of Palestine, even if not the first-hand work of the author, could 1 Jerusalem, I 390, 2. 440 introduction hardly have stood in its present form after the Roman occupation of Palestine. Nor would the story have been reproduced by Philo if not composed before AD 33. On the other hand, Sk.Ir's date appears to be rather too early. The sketch of Palestine and the Holy City may have been taken over by our author from an earlier writer, Hecataeus of Abdera, to whom he once, 31, expressly refers, and of whom there is reason to think that he made a more extensive use. Skier's other argument is derived from a passage of Aristobulus, who, addressing a Ptolemy commonly identified with Philometor, 182 to 146 BC, repeats the statement that the Pentateuch was translated under Philadelphus at the instance of Demetrius Phalerius, see Appendix 5, p. 95. This, in Schierer's opinion, implies that Aristobulus was acquainted with the Aristeas story. The genuineness of the Aristobulus passage has, however, been questioned by many recent critics. It is hard to believe that a fictitious story, A.S. Scheuer admits that of Aristeas to be, could have gained credence within little more than half a century after the period to which it relates. On the whole, an intermediate date, about Rizzo 80 BC, appears most probable. As already stated, the formulas, etc., employed are those of the later Ptolemaic age. The later Maccabean age, or the end of the 2nd century BC, is suggested by some of the translators' names, e.g. Jason. Some of Ptolemy's questions indicate a tottering dynasty, 187, etc. The writer appears to borrow his name from a Jewish historian of the 2nd century BC, and to wish to pass off the latter's history as his own. 6. The prologue to the Greek Ecclesiasticus, after 132 BC, ignores the Aristeas story, though too much must not be made of this argumentum E14 introduction silentio. The probable allusion, 3 ROF, to attempts which had been made to improve on the work of the translators, with the imprecation upon the offender, points to a growing divergence of text which the writer desired to check. With this should be compared the pointed reference to a difference between the Greek text and the Hebrew in a passage of Exodus 57. Allusions to current criticisms of the Pentateuch, R 28, 144, presuppose a familiarity with it on the part of non-Jewish readers, only explicable if the LXX had long been current. All these facts point to a date further removed from the age of Philadelphus than that which Scheuer would adopt. On the other hand, certain details in the Greek style and orthography seem to preclude a date much later than Ru BC. We have, then, to deal with a work which in some respects is obviously fictitious, and in others appears deserving of respect. Behind the romantic and apologetic framework there lies, no doubt, an element of truth. The story appears to be based, in part at least, on ancient popular tradition. Philo tells us, see Appendix p. 100, that in his day the translation was celebrated by an annual festival, attended by Jews and others, and held on the beach of the island of Pharos. It is improbable that an artificial production like the Aristeas letter should have occasioned such an anniversary. On the contrary, this piece of evidence suggests the existence of an independent tradition, and that one object of our letter may have been to supply a demand for a one. Conversely, the Palestinian Jews observed as a fast day the 8th Tevet December-January, on which the Torah was written in Greek in the days of King Ptolemy, and darkness came upon the world for 3 days. Appendix 1, p. 89. Introduction 15. Next account of the events commemorated at the festival. We are left with the difficult task of attempting to disentangle truth from fiction in the main narrative. The various questions raised are fully discussed by Dr. Sweet, in Trod to 0. T. Chapter I. The following statements in the letter appear deserving of credit. R. The Pentateuch forms a distinct corpus within the Greek Bible. It was translated first and, in view of the homogeneity of its style, as a whole. 2. The translation was produced at Alexandria, as is conclusively proved by the Egyptian influence on its lar. Gauge, to which the new-found papyri furnish the closest parallel. 3. The Greek Pentateuch goes back at least as far as the middle of the 3rd century BC. The Greek Genesis was towards the end of that century used by the Hellenist Demetrius. The style is akin to that of the earlier papyri, and reflects the period of the dawn of the Koiv when certain forms were in use which had already become obsolete in New Testament times. 4. It is not unlikely that the task was undertaken by a company of translators, though the traditional number, 70 or 72, is certainly legendary. A parallel may be found in a group of prophetical books, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Minor Prophets, where indications have been traced in the Greek of collaboration and a division of labor between members of a later compat_1y. 5. The Hebrew rolls were not improbably imported from Palestine. 6. Possibly Philadelphus, the patron of literature, with his known tastes and his syncretistic temperament, sweet, may have countenanced the work. On the other hand, the assertion that it owed its inception wholly to him and his librarian is incredible. It is known that Demetrius did not fill the office of librarian under that monarch. If he played any part 16 introduction in the work, it must have been in the reign of the predecessor of Philadelphus, Ptolemy I, Soter, and Dr. Sweet is inclined to believe that the project may have been discussed by him with the royal founder of the Alexandrian Library, and that the work was really due to his suggestion, though his words did not bear fruit until after his death, in Trod, Prg. There may even be an element of truth in the tradition of an older and less careful translation prior to the time of Philadelphus, cf. Arist 30, 314. But the existing version is written in the vernacular, not in a literary style suitable to a work produced under royal patronage. Again, the story of the importation of Palestinian translators is doubtless fictitious. Dr. Sweet acutely observes that Aristeas, in relating that the translation was read to and welcomed by the Jewish community before being presented to the king, 308 ff, unconsciously reveals its true aim. It was produced, we may be sure, to meet their own needs by the large Greek-speaking Jewish colony at Alexandria. Lectionary requirements and a demand that the law should be read in the synagogues in a tongue understood of the people were, we have reason to conjecture, the originating impulse. Later accretions to the legend won from being the Bible of the Jewish dispersion. The Greek Old Testament became the Bible of the early Church. The traditional story of its birth thus fitly finds a place in a series of documents illustrative of Christian origins. The Church Fathers accepted this story without suspicion and amplified it. Beside these later fabrications, the older narrative appears comparatively rational. The translators, it was now asserted, worked in Pend 1 Silhi Appendix. Introduction A to Ently in separate cells and produced identical versions, Ptolemy proposing this test of their trustworthiness, contrast Arist. 302, arriving at an agreement on each point by comparing each other's work. So say, e.g., Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria and the authors of the Chronicon Paschal and the Cohortatio ad Gracchos, P.S. Justin. The last writer asserts that he had seen the cells and heard the tradition on the spot. According to a modified form of the legend, the translators worked in pairs, in 36 cells, so Epiphanius and later writers. Epiphanius enters into great detail. The translators were, he says, locked up in skylight cells in pairs, with attendants and shorthand writers. Each pair was entrusted with one book. The books were then circulated and 36 identical versions of the whole Bible, canonical and apocryphal books, were produced. Ptolemy wrote 2 letters, one asking for the original scriptures, the second for translators. The story of the 2 embassies appears already in the 2nd century in Justin's Apology. The extension of the translators' work to the prophets or the whole Bible recurs in the 2 Cyrils and in Chrysostom. Lastly, the miraculous agreement of the translators proved them to be no less inspired than the original authors, so Irenaeus and others, Philo having already led the way. It is needless to dwell on these later inventions, the outcome, it seems, of a steadily growing oral tradition at Alexandria. Jerome justly held them up to ridicule, contrasting them with the older and more sober narrative. But a word may be said on a few points. 1. Cave dwellings in the island of Pharos may well account for the legend of the cells. 2. An ingenious explanation of the origin of the legend of the miraculous consensus B18 introduction of the 70, or 72, translators has been found. Hastings' Dictionary of the Bible, 439a, in a passage in Exodus XXIV, LXX, to which Epiphanius expressly refers. We them read of 70 elders of Israel who, with Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, form a link between Moses and the people. They do not follow Moses to the top of the mount, they ascend but a little way and are bidden to worship from afar. According to the Greek text, they saw the place where the God of Israel stood, and of the elect of Israel not one perished, i.e. they were privileged to escape the usual death penalty for a vision of the deity. But the verb used for perish, diaphonine, was uncommon in this sen_se, not one disagreed would be the more obvious meaning. Hence, it may be, arose both the number 70, or 72, and the legend of the supernatural agreement of the translators, the latter-day intermediaries between Moses and Israel of the dispersion. When the translations were recited, no difference was discoverable, writes Epiphanius, using the kindred word diaphonia. 3. An element of truth perhaps underlies one item in Epiphanius' generally incredible account, viz. the working of the translators in pairs. The Greek translations of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets, judged by their style, form a group and were probably produced en bloc by a company of translators. The translations of Jeremiah and Ezekiel fall into two nearly equal parts, a change of translators occurring in the middle of each book, while in other parts of the LXX a variety of practice in certain orthographical details indicates a similar division for clerical purposes. There was, it seems, a primitive custom of transcribing each book on two separate rolls, and in two books at least the practice goes right back to the time when the translation was made. Introduction 19 Bibliography The most recent editions of the Greek text are those of P. Wendland, Leipzig, 1900, in the Teubner series of classical texts, especially valuable for its appendix, containing the evidence of Jewish and patristic writers on the origin of the Greek version, and its full index of words, and H. St. J. Thackeray, printed as an appendix to Dr. Sweet's Introduction to the Old Testament in Greek, Cambridge, 1900, etc. An English translation, with introduction and commentary, by Professor H. T. Andrews, is included in Vol. 2 of Charles's Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament, Oxford, 1913, a German version by P. Wendland in Vol. 2 of Kosa's Apocryphan and Pseudepigraphan des Allen Testaments, Tübingen, 1900. An English version by the present translator, which appeared first in the Jewish Quarterly Review, April 1903, and then as a separate reprint, Macmillan, 1904, is superseded by the present work, except for some notes for which room could not here be found. An incomplete critical edition with Latin comment, Tryon R. 51, by L. Mendelssohn appeared in 1897. Of critical studies special mention may be made of Sweet's Introduction, Part I, Chapter I, and an essay by I. Abrahams in the Jewish Quarterly Review for January 1902. An article by P. Wendland is contributed to the Jewish Encyclopedia. For further literature reference may be made to Skier's History of the Jewish People, Div 2, Vol. 3, 310, 1897. The present translation is made from the text in Dr. Sweet's Introduction, Wendland's edition being consulted throughout. With the kind permission of the former editors, Mr. C. G. Montefiore and Mr. I. Abrahams, XX Introduction and Publishers, Messrs. Macmillan, of the Jewish Quarterly Review, it is based on the translation which appeared in that journal, but the whole has been carefully revised, with much assistance in particular from the recent version by Professor Andrews. The translator has also to acknowledge the permission kindly granted by the publishers of TJ1E International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, Howard Severance Company, Chicago, R915, to make use of his article, Septuagint, contained therein. The sections into which the text is divided are those of Wendland, these are introduced into the later editions of the Cambridge text. The appendix contains a selection of the principal passages in Jewish and Christian writings relating to the origin of the version of the 70. These are, it is believed, here collected for the first time in an English dress. For the rabbinic passages, which were not included in Wendland's Testimonia, the translator has to acknowledge the kind assistance of one of the editors of this series, Canon Box. As regards the use of italics, the principle of the revisers of the Old Testament has in general been followed, viz. Where any doubt existed as to the exact rendering, all words which have been added in order to give completeness to the English expression are printed in italic type, so that the reader by omitting them may be able to see how far their insertion is justified by the words of the original. The Letter of Aristeas, I, introductory address to Philocrates as the story of our deputation to Eleazar, the high one priest of the Jews, is worth the telling, and because thou, Philocrates, hast set thy heart, as thou art constantly reminding me, on learning the motives and purpose of our mission, I have endeavored to give thee a clear account of the matter. I know that love of learning of thine, and it is indeed man's highest task ever to make to addition to his store of learning and acquirements, one either by the study of history or by actual experience of affairs. The soul is thus built up in purity, by taking up into itself what is best, and with piety, supreme above all, as its aim, is assisted in its pursuit by an unerring guide. It was my devotion to the careful study of religion threewick, hed me to offer my services for the embassy to the man I have mentioned, who, owing to his virtuous character and exalted position, is held in high honor both by his countrymen and by the rest of the world, and is in possession of documents of the greatest service to his nation, whether at home or abroad, for the translation of the divine law, because it exists in their country written on parchment in Hebrew characters. This embassy then for one these words form an iambic line in the Greek, and are probably a quotation from and a lost tragedy. A lit. R. Us. I. R. 2122 The Letter of Aristeas I undertook with enthusiasm, after finding an opportunity of approaching the king on the subject of the men who were removed to Egypt from Judea by the king's father, when first he took ever the city too and the government of Egypt. This story also it is worth while my telling thee. For I am persuaded that thou above all men, with thy leanings towards the holiness and the sentiments of the men who live in accordance with the holy law, wilt gladly listen to the story about them which I purpose to narrate, having but recently come over from the island 3 to us and being anxious to 6 hear whatever makes for the soul's edification. On a former occasion, too, I sent thee a description of matters in my opinion worthy of record concerning the Jewish nation, which I obtained from the high priests, the most 7 learned body in that most learned land of Egypt. It is right to communicate such things to thee with thy eagerness to learn what may benefit the mind. Very willingly would I impart them to all who are like-minded with thee, but chiefly to thee, so sincere are thy principles, and not only does thy character shew thee to be my brother by birth, but in thy striving after goodness thou art at 1/8 with me. 11 For neither the attraction of gold nor any other of the objects that the vainglorious hold in honor confers the same benefit as a cultured training and the pains expended thereon. But, not to weary you with too long an introduction, I will resume the thread of the narrative. 61 Lit. We. 2 Alexandria. 3 Probably Cyprus is meant. 4 Possibly the writer wishes to identify himself with the historian Aristeas, who wrote a work about the Jews, a fragment of which is preserved by Eusebius. 6 Lit. With us. Perhaps with a slight transposition of words we should read, and not only art thou my brother by birth, but also in thy character, which in its striving after goodness is alson to ours, sf. I mace. 2J2, The Letter of Aristeas 23, 2, Origin of the Scheme and Preliminary Proceedings, a. The proposal of the king's librarian Demetrius of Phalrum 1. As keeper of the king's 9 library, received large grants of public money with a view to his collecting, if possible, all the books in the world, and by purchases and transcriptions he to the best of his ability carried the king's purpose into execution. Being asked once in my presence, about how many sands of books were already collected, he replied more than 200,000, 30 king, and I will ere long make diligent search for the remainder, so that a total of 500,000 may be reached. I am informed that the Jews also have certain laws which are deserving of transcription in a place in thy library. What is to hinder thee, then, replied the king, in this task? For all the necessary means are at thy service. And Demetrius answered, translation is also required. For in the Jews' land they use a peculiar script, just as Egyptians have their system of letters, and speak a peculiar language. It is commonly thought that they use the Syrian 5 language, but this is an error, it is another dialect. And when the king had learned all the facts, he gave command that a letter should be written to the high priest of the Jews, in order that the proposal above mentioned might be carried into effect. 1 Demetrius lived from about 345 13 C to about 283 BC. The last part of his life was spent at the court of Ptolemy Soter, but he was out of favor with Ptolemy Philadelphus and banished by him. Vr. Ue was never the royal librarian. Lit. Ra lit. Arrangement. Tens of thousands. I.e. Aramaic. 24. The Letter of Aristeas, b. The emancipation of the Jewish slaves. 1-2. And now thought I was the opportunity for introducing a matter about which I had often made request to Sosabius of Tarentum and Andreas, the heads of the bodyguard, namely, the liberation of the Jews who had been carried away from Judea by the king's father. For he, after overrunning the whole of Coel Syria and Phoenicia, assisted by good fortune and his own prowess, transplanted some and made prisoners of others, terrorizing and reducing the whole country to submission. It was on this occasion that he carried away more than 113,000 persons from the Jews' country into Egypt, of which number he armed about 30,000 picked men and settled them in the fortresses in the country. Many Jews had already before this entered the country along with the Persian one, and others had at a still earlier time been sent out as auxiliaries to fight in the army of Samadicius II against the king of the Ethiopians, but these immigrants were not so large a body as those whom 14 Ptolemy, son of Lagus, introduced. Well, as we said before, he selected those who were best fitted for service by age and physique, and armed them, but the remaining mass, those who were too old or too young for service, and the women as well, he reduced to bondage, not of his own free will, but rather compelled thereto by the soldiers, who assigned them in return for the services which they had rendered in action. Having, therefore, found some pretext for their release, one Cambyses, who conquered Egypt in 525 BC. 2 Samadictans was king of Egypt from about 671 to 617 EC, he was the first king of Egypt to employ Greek mercenaries in foreign campaigns, HDT 2151 FF. Others think that Sarnmis or Samadicius II, he is sometimes called, is here intended. He became king of Egypt in 601 BC, and waged war against Ethiopia, HDT 2159 to 161. The Letter of Aristeas 25. As already explained, I addressed the king somewhat as follows: it would surely be unreasonable, 0 King, to 1-5 let our deeds give the lie to our words. 4. As the laws which we are proposing not only to transcribe but also to translate are binding on all Jews, what justification shall we find for our mission, whilst large numbers of the race continue in slavery in thy kingdom? Nay, with a perfect and bounteous heart release those who are held fast in miseries, since the same God who gave them their law directs thy kingdom, as my research has taught me. For the God who sees and created all things whom 1-6 they worship is he whom all men worship, and we too, 0 King, though we address him by other names as Zeus and Dis, and by these names they of old time not inappropriately signified that he, through whom all things receive their life and being, is the director and lord of all. 2 Outdo, then, all men in magnanimity, and set at liberty those who are held in bondage. The king kept silence for a while, and I inwardly 17 prayed to God to dispose his mind to a general release. For the human race, being God's creation, is swayed and moved by him, and therefore I called with many and diverse prayers upon him that rules the heart, that he might be constrained to fulfill my desire. For I bade 18 a good hope, in bringing forward a proposal concerning the deliverance of men 3 that God would cause the fulfillment of my desires, for when men piously think that they are working for righteousness and the furtherance of good deeds, it is God Almighty who directs their actions. 1 Litwi, 2 The two accusative forms of zevs, viz. Zijva and are here derived from ijv, to live, and elad, through. This etymology is found in Orphic and other writings. See the Orphic fragment quoted by Blas on Acts 17. 28 3 cf 292. It is unnecessary to read the men. 26 The Letter of Aristeas and Designs. But the king, raising his head and looking 19 at me with a cheerful countenance, said, How many thousands dost thou suppose there will be? And Andreas, who was standing close by, replied, A little over 100,000. Of a truth, said he, it is but a small request which Aristeas makes of us. But Sozobius and some others who were present said, it is indeed an action worthy of thy magnanimity to offer the release of these men as a thank-offering to the Most High God. For, as thou hast been most highly honored by the Almighty and exalted above thy forefathers, so is it fitting that thou shouldest make the very highest of 20 thank-offerings. And he, greatly delighted, gave orders that the redemption money should be added to the soldiers' pay, for every slave the owner should receive 20 drachmas, a decree should be published on the subject, and the registers should be drawn up forthwith. So magnificent was his zeal, and thus did God fulfill our whole desire, constraining him to liberate not only those who had entered the country with his father's army, but also any who were there before or had since been introduced into the kingdom too. It was pointed out that the donation would exceed 400 talents. 21. And I think that it will not be without use to have on record here a copy of the decree. For the munificence of the king, who was empowered by God to be the means of deliverance to vast multitudes, will thus be made far clearer and more evident. It ran thus: Point 22. By the king's decree, all persons who served in the campaign of our father against the regions of Syria and Phoenicia and in the 1gr tens of thousands possibly some words have here fallen out in the MSS, the Letter of Aristeas 27 invasion of the territory of the Jews, and became possessors of Jewish slaves, and have brought these over into the city of Alexandria and the country of Egypt, or have sold them to others. Likewise also if any such were beforetime in the country or have since been introduced, they owners shall straightway release them. Compensation shall forthwith be paid for every slave 20 drachmas, to the soldiers with their pay, and to the rest at the royal bank. We consider that the making of these 23 persons prisoners was contrary to the will of our father and to justice, and that the spoliation of their country and the transportation of the Jews into Egypt were due to military recklessness. The spoil which accrued to the soldiers on the field of battle should have sufficed to reduce the people to subjection. In addition was wholly inequitable, forasmuch then as it is our recognized 24 practice to award justice to all men, but chiefly to those who are unreasonably oppressed, and we do always strive to deal fairly with all men in accordance with the dictates of justice and piety. We have decreed that the owners of all Jewish persons who are held in bondage anywhere one in any manner within the kingdom, shall on receipt of the prescribed sum release them. No one shall in any way be dilatory in the discharge of these duties, but within 3 days from the date of publication of this decree they shall hand in their lists to those who are set over this business, and shall also at once produce the persons. For we are resolved that it is expedient for 25 ourselves and for the realm that this matter be accomplished. Any who will may give information concerning defaulters, on condition that the informer shall become owner of the person if found guilty, but the mended text, 28. The letter of Aristeas property of such persons shall be confiscated to the royal purse. 26. When the decree was submitted to be read over to the king, containing all the rest with the exception of the words, also if any such were beforetime in the country or have since been introduced, the king himself out of his munificence and magnanimity appended this clause. He also gave orders to assign a grant of the moneys in a lump sum to the paymasters of the forces 27 and the royal bankers. The matter was thus decided and the decree was ratified within 7 days. The donation amounted to over 661 talents, for many children at the breast were also liberated along with the mothers. When the further question was referred, whether 20 drachmas should be given for these as well, the king ordered that this also should be done. So thoroughly in every detail did he give effect to the decision. See the librarian's memorial. 28. And when this business was ended, he ordered Demetrius to submit a statement concerning the transcription of the Jewish books. For all business used to be transacted by these kings too by means of decrees and with great precaution, and nothing was done in an offhand or casual manner. And therefore have I set down here copies of the memorial and the letters, and the number of the presents sent, and the nature of each, for every one of these excelled in magnificence and technical skill. And the following is a copy of the memorial. 1 Tosfos writes, over 460 talents. The writer here betrays that he lived at a later age than that which he is describing. The letter of Aristeas 29 to the great king from Demetrius in obedience 29 to thy order, 0 King, that the books which are wanting to complete the library should be added to the collection, and that those which are defective should be duly repaired. I have expended great care upon these matters and now submit a reference to thee. The books of the 30 Jewish law with some few others are wanting. They are written in Hebrew letters and in the Hebrew tongue, and have been interpreted one somewhat too carelessly and do not represent the original text, according to information supplied by the experts, because they have never received a king's fostering care. It is necessary that these books too should in an amended form find a place in 31 thy library, because this code of laws, in that it is divine, is full of wisdom 3 and faultless. For this reason authors, poets, and the mass of the historians have abstained from any mention of the books aforesaid and of the men who have lived and are living for in accordance with them, because the views presented in them have a certain sanctity and holiness, as says Hecataeus of Abdera. 5 If then it be thy good pleasure, 0 King, a letter shall be 32 written to the high priest at Jerusalem, bidding him send 6 elders from each tribe, men of the highest repute and versed in their countries' law, in order that we may test wherein the more part agree, and so obtaining in one if RR/Iana, is correctly rendered, there appears to he a reference to an earlier Greek translation of the law than the LXX, cf 314. Aristobulus in a well-known passage refers to such a translation, see Appendix, p. 95, Suite, Introd to 0. T. P. If. Fer/Ira, may, however, merely mean committed to writing. The explanation of deals that incorrect vocalization is re/erd to is ingenious. 1 or very. 3 lit. Most, or more, philosophical. 4 perhaps a gloss. 5 a contemporary of Alexander the Great and Ptolemy I an author of a history of Egypt. Cf 312 ff 30 The Letter of Aristeas accurate translation may deposit it in a conspicuous place 1 in a manner worthy of the undertaking and of thy 33 gracious will. Fare ever well. 2 When this memorial had been presented, the king ordered that a letter should be written to Eleazar on these matters, informing him also of the emancipation of the captives. He presented also towards the construction of bowls and vials and a table and cups for libations 50 talents weight of gold and 70 talents of silver and of precious stones a great number, enjoining the treasurers to leave to the craftsmen the selection of such materials as they might desire, and for sacrifices and other purposes as much as 100 talents in money. D. The letters of Ptolemy/Iy and Eleazar 34 I8 will give thee an account of the construction of the gifts when I3 have set out copies of the letters. The tenor of the king's letter was as follows 35 King Ptolemaeus to Eleazar the high priest greeting and health. Forasmuch as there are many Jews settled in our realm who were forcibly removed from Jerusalem by the Persians at the time of their power, and others who 36 entered Egypt as captives in the train of our father of these he enrolled many in the army, giving them higher than the ordinary pay, and in like manner, having proved one i.e. in the Alexandrian library, cf 38. But the sense is doubtful, possibly we should translate may make the meaning plain. 2e at 6x, as Mahaffy has shown, is the regular formula at the end of an address from a subordinate to his superior, and is therefore correctly used here. A per on addressing his subordinate or his equal uses LPPW2, so in the letters that follow, 40, 46. Lit. We. N. The letter of Aristeas 31 The loyalty of those who were already in the country, he placed under their charge the fortresses which he built, that the native Egyptians might 1 be intimidated by them, and we 2 since ascending the throne meet all men, but chiefly thy countrymen, in a very friendly spirit we, then, have given liberty to more than 37,000 captives, paying their owners the proper market price, and making good any wrong which they may have suffered through the passions of the mob. Our intent in this was to do a pious action and to dedicate a thank offering to the Most High God, who has preserved our kingdom in peace and in the highest esteem throughout the whole world. Moreover, we have drafted into the army those who are in the prime of life, and to such as are fitted to be attached to our person and deserving of the confidence of court have we assigned offices of state. Now since we desire to confer 38 a favor not on these only, but on all Jews throughout the world and on future generations, it is our will that your law be translated from the Hebrew tongue in use among you too into Greek, that so these writings also may find a place in our library with the other royal volumes. Thou wilt therefore do well and wilt repay our zeal, if 39 thou lookest out 6 elders from each tribe, men of high repute, well versed in the law and able to translate, that we may discover wherein the more part agree, for the investigation concerns matters of more than ordinary import. We think to gain great renown by the fulfillment of this task. We have sent on this business 40 Andreas, of the chief of the bodyguards, and Aristeas who hold honored places in our court, to confer with one so Josephus and Eusebius. Negative. 2 or as you call it. The Aristeas M.SS insert a 32 The letter of Aristeas They bring with them dedicatory offerings for the temple, and for sacrifices and other purposes 100 talents of silver. And shouldest thou also write to us concerning my desires, thou wilt do a favor and a friendly service, and be assured that thy wishes will receive instant fulfillment. Farewell. 41 To this letter Eleazar replied appropriately one as follows: Eleazar the high priest to King Ptolemaeus, his sincere friend, greeting. Do thou farewell and the Queen Arsinoe, thy sister, and the children, too, so will it be. 42 Well, and as we desire, we too are in good health. On receiving thy letter we greatly rejoiced because of thy purpose and noble resolve, and we collected the whole people and read it to them, in order that they might know thy pious reverence for our God. We shewed them also the vials which thou sentest, 20 of gold and 30 of silver, the 5 bowls, and the table as dedicatory offerings, and the 100 talents of silver for the offering of sacrifices and for such repairs as 43 the temple may require. These gifts were brought by Andreas, one of thy honored courtiers, and Aristeas, good men, and true and of excellent learning, who in all ways worthily reflect thy high principles and righteousness. They have also imparted to us thy message, and have heard from our lips a reply in accordance with thy 44 letter. For in all things which are to thy profit, even though thy request is contrary to our natural impulses, 3 will we do thy bidding. This indeed is a mark of friendship and affection. For thou too hast in divers manners won o'er to the best of his ability. Perhaps so far as he could write Greek, the writer excusing the use of this language by a Jew of Palestine, Wendland. Arsinoe too, here referred to, is said to have been childless but to have adopted the children of Arsinoe I3 lit contrary to nature. The letter of Aristeas 33 done great services to our countrymen which can never pass out of mind. We therefore straightway offered 45 sacrifices on thy behalf and on behalf of thy sister and thy children and thy friends. 1 And the whole people prayed that thy undertakings might ever prosper, and that Almighty God would preserve thy kingdom in peace with honor, and that the translation too of the holy law might be to thy profit and carefully executed. And in 46 the presence of them all we selected 6 elders from each tribe, good men and true, whom we are also sending with a copy of the law. Thou wilt then do well, righteous king, to give orders that, so soon as the translation too of the books be accomplished, the men be restored to us again in safety. Farewell. The names of the translators and their names 3 are, of the first tribe, Joseph, 47 Ezechias 4 Zacharias, John, Ezechias 4 Elisha, of the second, Judas, Simon, Samuel 5 Adahus 6 Mattathias, Eshlemias 7, of the third, Nehemias, Joseph, Theodosius, Basques, Ornias, Dakis, of the fourth, Jonathas, 4 Grams Abraias, Elisha, Ananias, Zacharias 8 Chelkias 8, of the fifth, Isaac, Jacob, Jesus, Sabbathaius, Simon, Levi, of the sixth, Judas, Joseph, Simon, Zacharias, Samuel 5 Selemias, of the seventh, Sabbathaius, Zedekias, Jacob, 49 Isaac, Isaias 9 Nathias, of the eighth, Theodosius, 1 A court title. 2 or transcription. 3 The names, according to Josephus, form a postscript to the letter. 4 One of these names is probably corrupt. Text Samoelus. 6 Either Adea, 114, or Ido, LTL 1Y. 7 Representing, comma, which is more correctly represented by LE. E1. 1 in 48. The names Zacharias, Chelcias are derived from the list in the Syriac version of Epiphanius, de MMS. ETJJ1JND, who uses the narrative of Aristeas, see Appendix, P2IF. In the MSS of Aristeas XA/3P, S stands in place of Zacharias and the sixth name in this tribe has disappeared. 9 probably equals Jesse, Epiphan. It, C34 The Letter of Aristeas Jason, Jesus, Theodotus, John, Jonathas, of the 9th, Theophilus, Abraham, Arsamas, Jason, En50 Demias, Daniel, of the 10th, Jeremy, Eleazar, Zacharias, Banias, Elisha, Dathias 1, of the 11th, Samuel, Joseph, Judas, Jonathas, Caleb 2 Dositheus, of the 12th, Isaelis, John, Theodosius, Arsamas, Abiats, Ezekiel, in all 72 persons. 51 Such, then, was the reply which Eleazar III gave to the king's letter. 3. Description of the royal presents. I will now fulfill the promise which I made to describe the works of art. They were wrought with extraordinary skill, as the king, in addition to his large grants, also exercised a constant supervision over the craftsmen, so that they could not neglect or scamp any part of the 52 work. I will first give thee an account of the table. Now, the king's intention was to make this piece of work of gigantic dimensions. However, he caused inquiries to be made of persons in the locality as to the size of the previous table 4 which stood in the temple at Jerusalem, 53, and when they reported the dimensions, he inquired further whether he should make one on a larger scale. Some of the priests and of the people said that there was nothing to prevent him. But the king replied that, though his wish was to make his gift 5 times as large, yet he doubted whether such a table might not be 54 useless for the public ministrations. It was not his desire that his offerings should merely be placed in the temple, it would afford him far greater satisfaction, if one or Thaddeus, as one MS reads. So Epiphanius. The MSS have XO/3 EII. 8 or EL and his colleagues, i.e. the table of showbread. The letter of Aristeas 35. The appropriate services were duly performed by the proper minitures on the structures which he had designed. He added that the small scale on which the former 55 works were constructed was not due to any lack of gold, but was apparently so planned for some definite reason. For one had any injunction been given one for a larger table, there would have been no lack of means, it was not therefore right to surpass or exceed the fit measurements. At the same time he ordered that the utmost diversity 56 of artistic skill should be employed, for all his conceptions were on a grand scale, and he had a natural gift of imagination enabling him to picture the appearance which objects would present. 2. He gave orders too that details as to which there were no instructions in the Jud-sh scripture should be beautified. Wherever written directions were given, the craftsmen were to be guided by these in the measurements. So they fashioned the table 2 cubits in length, 357 and a cubit and a half in height, making the work of pure gold and perfectly solid. I mean, the gold was not overlaid upon other material, but the whole was one massive plate of beaten metal. And they made 58 a border of an handbreadth round about, with rails that revolved 5 and bore a design of ropes in relief. 1 amended text. 1 or for designing the appearance of objects. The artistic talent of Philadelphus is attested by the historians of his time. 3 Perhaps we should insert, with Josephus, and a cubit in breadth. The following description, obscure in many details, is an elaboration of the description of the table of showbread in Exodus XXV. 23, 22, ff, LXX. Lit. The plate was itself affixed. The writer follows the LXX, gold, of pure GOLJ, as against the Hebrew, thou shalt overlay it with pure gold. G meaning doubtful, lit twisted moldings. In Exodus some kind of cable molding may be intended. In Aristeas the context, with the paraphrase of Josephus, suggests a triangular rotatory bar crowning the border and turning on pivots at the corners. 36 The Letter of Aristeas 59 Marvelously wrought on the three sides. For the rails were triangular in shape, and the work on each side was fashioned upon the same pattern, so that, whichever way they were turned, the appearance was the same, and as the rail rested on the border that side of it which sloped towards the table was beautifully worked, although the side which sloped outwards alone met the eye of the spectator. And so the edge in which the two sloping sides met was a sharp one and, whichever way the rail was turned, held the uppermost place, since, as we have said already, the shape was a triangular one. And precious stones were inlaid in the rail between the rope work, set one kind beside another. They were interwoven in an 61 inimitable manner. And they were all perforated and securely fastened by golden pins. And at the angles 62 the clamps held them firmly in their places. Over against the border and slanting upwards to meet the eyes there was an egg pattern encircling the table, wrought of precious stones and elaborately worked too with a series of flutings and relief work, packed closely together round 63 the whole table. And beneath the raised work of the stones which formed the egg pattern the craftsman made a crown of fruits of all kinds, projecting from it were shown vine clusters and corn ears, dates also and apples and olives and pomegranates and the like. They worked the stones, which had the color of each species of the aforesaid fruits, to resemble those fruits, and attached 64 them to the gold all round the sides of the table. And next to the crown the egg pattern was worked over again, and the rest of the fluted and relief work, because the table was made to be used on either side according to choice 3 and with such symmetry that the rails and the one text doubtful. Text uncertain. 3 Text slightly amended. The Letter of Aristeas 37 border reappeared on the side nearest the feet. 465 They made a plate of solid metal, 4 fingers broad, extending along one the whole breadth of the table, into which the legs could be inserted, these being provided with pins and clamps to secure them to the border, in order that either side of the table might be used according to choice. 2 Thus the same appearance was presented whichever side of the work was placed uppermost. 3 On the top of the table they worked a meander 466 in relief, with costly precious stones of divers kinds 11 standing out in the middle of it, carbuncles and emeralds and onyx and stones of other sorts which are noted for their beauty. And next to the meander there was a 67 wonderful design of open network 6 giving a lozenge-shaped 7 pattern to the center of the table, and into this were inlaid crystal and the so-called electron 8 affording an inimitable spectacle to the beholders. And the legs 968 they made with lily-shaped capitals, the lilies bending over beneath the table, while the parts which met the eye were the upright leaves. The basis of the leg which 69 rested on the ground consisted entirely of carbuncle, a hand-breadth high and of 8 fingers breadth, and in appearance had the shape of a shoe. Upon this rested the whole weight 10 of the leg. And they represented 70 ivy, intertwined with acanthus, growing out of the stone and encircling the leg, together with a vine and its clusters, these being worked in stone, right up to the top. The pattern of the 4 legs was the same, all the parts were one or under. 2 Text slightly amended. 3 Meaning uncertain, text amended, to al, ti, for tovtu, after Josephus. Or maze. Text amended. Lit. A wonderful cloven web. 7 Or rhombus-like. Probably amber. 9 Lit. Feet, and so throughout. 1 Lit. Metal plate, as in 65. 38 The Letter of Aristeas carefully made and attached and with such consummate skill and craftsmanship as exactly to resemble nature, insomuch that if a breath of air blew upon them the leaves stirred in their places, so closely was every detail 71 modelled upon the reality. The front one of the table they made in 3 pieces, as it were a triptych, the pieces being fitted together by dovetailing which was secured by pegs in the thickness of the structure, while the joinings were rendered invisible and undiscoverable. The thickness of the whole table was no less than half a cubit, so that the cost f the whole work amounted to 72 many talents. 4. As the king had determined not to add to its size, he expended all the more upon these details, 2 even as much as would have been required for a table on a larger scale, and in accordance with his purpose the whole was completed in a marvelous and memorable style, with inimitable art and transcendent beauty. 73 Of the mixing bowls too were wrought in gold, and from their bases to halfway up their sides bore a device of scales in relief, with precious stones cunningly set 74 between the scales. Then above this was a meander, a cubit in height, with its surface 8 wrought out of precious stones of divers hues, and displaying not only beauty but the most elaborate skill. Over this was a mosaic of interlacing lozenge-shaped figures extending to the 75 brim and producing the appearance of network. In the middle were bosses of precious stones of various kinds, arranged alternately, and not less than 4 fingers broad, which enhanced the beauty of the spectacle. Round the crown of the brim were worked lilies with their 76 blossoms and intertwining vine clusters. Such was the one lit. Mouth. 2 ttxt and meaning doubtful. 3 text c, renended, the letter of Aristeas 39 fashion of the golden bowls, and they contained over 2 firkins each. The silver bowls had a smooth surface, and formed a veritable mirror, the marvel of them consisting in this very smoothness, which was such that anything brought close to them was reflected more clearly than in mirrors. But it is impossible to describe the 77 real impression produced by the completed one works of art, for when the vessels were finished and were set side by side, that is to say, first a silver bowl, then a golden, then another silver and another golden one, at nature of the sight was quite indescribable, and those who came to view it could not tear themselves from it, so dazzling was the brilliance and so entrancing the V1s1 on. There was variety in the effect of the spectacle. 78 If one looked at the gold work, it was one of enchantment and astonishment, as the mind took in one by one each detail of the execution. And again, when one wished to turn one's eyes to the silver vessels set out before him, all the surrounding objects were reflected, wherever one stood, causing a still greater ecstasy to the beholders. So the artistic skill displayed in the works is quite beyond description. On the golden vials they engraved vine wreaths in the 79 center, and about the rims they entwined in relief work a wreath of ivy and myrtle and olive, in which they set precious stones. And the rest of the relief work they wrought in various patterns, holding it a point of honor to make everything in a manner worthy of the king's majesty. In a word, neither in the king's treasury nor in any other was there the like of these works for costliness and artistic skill. No little thought was spent upon them by the king, who loved to gain a remutation for the excellence of his designs. For oft times 81 one text, lit. Completed beforehand, doubtful. 40 The letter of Aristeas he would neglect his public business one and would carefully supervise the craftsmen, to see that they executed the works in a manner befitting the place to which they were to be sent. And so they were all made in a magnificent style and were worthy of the king who was sending them and of the high priest who was the governor 82 of the place. So lavish was the supply of precious stones, not less than 5,000 were used, and they were all of large size, and so first-rate was all the craftsmanship, that the expenditure upon the precious stones and the skilled work amounted to 5 times the value of the gold. 4. Description of Jerusalem and its vicinity. I have given thee this description of the presents because I considered it to be necessary. The next portion of my letter contains an account of our journey to Eleazar, but first I will describe the situation of the whole country. When we reached the district, we beheld the city set in the center of the whole of Judea upon a mountain which rose to a great height. A. The temple, entrance, veil, altar 84. Upon its crest stood the temple Indiana splendor, with its 3 enclosing walls, more than 70 cubits high, and of a breadth and length matching the structure of the edifice. The whole was built with a magnificence and its prodigality beyond all precedent. It was obvious that no expense had been spared on the great doorway and the fastenings which held it to the doorposts and the 86 stability of the lintel. And the curtain was made very one or levy, giving audience to ambassadors, etc. The letter of Aristeas 41 closely to resemble a door. 1. The fabric was kept in perpetual motion by the draught of wind underneath, which caused it to bulge out from bottom to top. 1. And the effect was a beautiful spectacle, from which it was hard to tear oneself away. The altar was built of a size in keeping with the place 87 and with the sacrifices which were consumed by fire, and the ascent to it was on a like scale. The place was approached by a gradual slope from a proper regard for decency. 2. And the ministering priests were clad in coats of fine linen 3 reaching to the ankles. B. the temple water supply. The temple 4 looks towards the east, and its back is 88 turned westwards. The whole floor is paved with stones and slopes down to the appropriate places, so as to admit of its being flushed with water to wash away the blood from the sacrifices, for many thousand beasts are offered on the feast days. The water supply is inexhaustible. 89. An abundant natural spring bubbles up within the temple area. There are, moreover, wonderful underground reservoirs passing description, at a distance, as they pointed out to me, of 5 furlongs all round the site of the temple, each with innumerable pipes, so that the various channels converge. It was explained, too, how all these cisterns had 90 their bases and sides overlaid with lead, and over them is laid a great mass of plaster, so that everything is made secure, and how there are numerous outlets at the base of the altar, which are invisible to all except the actual ministrants, so that all the vast accumulation of sacrificial one text and meaning not quite certain. 2 cf Exodus XX 26:3 Exodus XXXVI 35 LXX XXXIX 27 MT. Lit. House. 42 The Letter of Aristeas 91 Blood is swept away in the twinkling of an eye. Such is my belief as to the nature of the reservoirs, and I will explain how it was confirmed. They led me more than 4 furlongs out of the city, and at a certain place bade me stoop down and listen to the rushing noise of the meeting of the waters. Thus was the magnitude of the receptacles made evident to me, as I have described them. C. The priests and the public services 92 The priest's ministration in its exhibition of physical strength and in its orderly and silent performance could in no way be surpassed. For they all of their own free will undergo labors requiring much endurance, and each has his appointed task. Their service is without intermission, some providing the wood, others oil, others fine wheat flour, others the spices, while others again bring the pieces of flesh for the burnt offering, displaying 93 extraordinary strength. For they grip with both hands the legs of the calves, most of which weigh over 2 talents, and then with both hands and with wonderful dexterity fling the beast to a considerable height, and never fail to plant it on the altar. The portions of the sheep and goats are, likewise, remarkable for their weight and fat. For those whose duty it is always select such beasts as are without blemish and of exceeding fatness, and then the service already described is performed. 94 There is a place set apart for them to rest, where those who are relieved from duty take their seats. And thereupon, some of those who have had an interval of relaxation rise up willingly, without any order for their 95 ministration being given. The deepest silence prevails, so that one would suppose that there was not a single person in the place, although the ministers in attendance. The Letter of Aristeas 43 number some 700, not to mention the large multitude of those who bring their sacrifices to be offered. Everything is performed with reverence and in a manner worthy of the divine majesty. 1. D. The high priest's vestments. And when we beheld Eleazar in the course of his 96 ministration, and his apparel, and the lustre lent by the wearing of the coat too wherewith he is clad, and the precious stones about his person, we were struck with a great amazement. For there are bells of gold around the border of his long robe, giving out a peculiar musical sound, and on either side of these are pomegranates embroidered in gay colors of a marvelous hue. He was girt with a rich and magnificent girdle, 397 woven in the fairest colors. And on his breast he wears what is called the oracle, for wherein are set 12 stones of divers kinds, fastened with gold, bearing the names of the heads of the tribes according to their original order, each of them flashing forth in indescribable fashion its own natural hue. On his head 98 he has the tiara, as it is called, and over this the inimitable turban, 5 the consecrated diadem, bearing engraven upon a plate of gold in holy letters the name of God, set between his eyebrows, full of glory. Such is the raiment of him 6 who is judged worthy of these things in the public services. And the general aspect of 99 these things produces awe and discomfiture, insomuch that one thinks that one has passed into another sphere outside the world. Indeed, I confidently affirm that any one lit. Great divinity. 0 Exodus XXVII 4, 31-35. 3/lid. 39 4 Ibid 15-21, XXXIX. 8 ff or mitre. Exodus XXVIII. 36 ff, Iklas. XLV 12. Some words appear to have fallen out in the Greek. 44 The letter of Aristeas. Man who witnesses the spectacle which I have described will experience an amazement and wonder indescribable, and will be profoundly moved in his mind at the sanctity attaching to every detail. The citadel and its guards. 100 To obtain an accurate knowledge of everything, we ascended to the citadel of the city, which lies hard by, and looked around us. It is situated on a very lofty spot and is fortified with several towers, which are constructed right up to the top of great blocks of stone, as a defense, so we are informed, to the precincts of the Roer temple, so that, in case of any attack or revolution or invasion of an enemy, no one might effect an entrance within the ring walls of the temple. 1 On the towers of the citadel there are engines for discharging missiles and machines of divers kinds, and the place commands the RO2 enclosing walls aforementioned. The towers are guarded, too, by the most trusted men, whose achievements have fully proved their loyalty to their country. These men had orders not to quit the citadel, except on the feast days, and then only in turn, nor did they suffer anyone 103 to enter it. Even when any injunction was given by their leader to admit any persons as sightseers, great care was exercised, as was shown in our case. For although we were but 2 unarmed men, they could hardly be brought to admit us to witness the offering of Jo for the sacrifices. And they said that they were pledged by oaths to act thus. For they all had sworn, and had of bounden duty and for conscience' sake fulfilled their bond, that they, although numbering 500 men, one lit house. Apparently the high priest is meant, cf 122. The letter of Aristeas 45 would not admit more than 5 persons at the same time, for the citadel was the one protection of the temple, and its founder had thus securely fortified its tower of defense. The city and its streets. The city is of moderate proportions, its circuit being 105 about 40 furlongs, to give a rough estimate. In the disposition of its towers and of the thoroughfares which appear, some below, some above, with the cross streets through them, it has the familiar one aspect of a theatre. For the ground is irregular, as the city is built on a mountain. There are also stairways leading to the 106 thoroughfares. For some persons take their way along the higher level, and others underneath too, and they keep as far as possible from each other on the road because of those who are undergoing the usual purifications, to prevent them from touching any forbidden thing. Small and large cities contrasted. It was not without reason that the original founders 107 built the city of convenient proportions, but from a wise insight. For as the country is extensive and fair, and some parts, namely those in Samaria so called, and those adjoining the country of the Idumeans, are level plain, while other parts are mountainous 3 namely those adjoining the country of Judea, the inhabitants must 3 devote their unremitting attention to agriculture and the care of the soil, in order that these latter districts may first amended text. See on 105 F. G. A. Smith, Jerura, M. 2. 440 F2 The meaning is doubtful. Restored by conjecture, some words having been lost in the manuscripts. 46 The letter of Aristeas also thereby obtain a plentiful supply of crops. In this way cultivation of every sort is carried on and an abundant harvest reaped throughout the whole of the R08 aforesaid land. On the other hand, it has been the fate of all large and consequently prosperous cities to be thickly populated themselves, while they neglect the country, as the thoughts of every one are bent on enjoyment, and all men have a natural propensity to pleasure. 109 And this is what happened to Alexandria, a city which surpasses all others in size and prosperity. The country folk by migrating to the town and making a long stay there brought agriculture to a low ebb. And so the king, to prevent them from making a stay, ordered that their visits should not exceed 20 days, and he likewise gave written injunctions to the officials, that if it were necessary to summon any such persons to town, and they should decide their cases within 5 days. And as he considered the matter one of great importance, he appointed judges with their subordinates in every district one that so the farmers and their agents too might not, while money making in the city, reduce the granaries of the city, I mean the proceeds of agriculture. H. The country and its produce, harbors, rivers, mountain ranges rrz. We have been led into this digression by Eleazar's admirable exposition to us of the principles just mentioned. Their industry in agriculture is indeed great. For their country is thickly planted with olive trees and is rich in cereal produce and pulse, in vines also and honey in abundance, fruit trees of other kinds and palms are beyond reckoning with them. There are cattle and one the Egyptian nome. 2 meaning doubtful. The Letter of Aristeas 47 abundance of all sorts, and rich pasturage for them. And so they rightly recognized that the rural districts N3 needed a dense population, and they constructed the city and the villages in correct proportions. A great N4 mass of spices, precious stones, and gold is brought into the district by the Arabs. For the country is well adapted for commerce as well as for cultivation, and the city is rich in the arts and lacks none of the merchandise that is brought across the sea. It possesses havens well ir5 situated which supply its needs, that at Ascalon, and Joppa, and Gaza, as well as Ptolemy which was founded by the king one and holds a central position compared with these places, not being far distant from any of them. The country enjoys everything in plenty, being well watered on every side and securely enclosed. Round I6 it there flows the river called the Jordan which never runs dry. The country originally comprised not less than 60 million acres, although subsequently the neighboring peoples encroached upon to it, and 600,000 men became possessors of lots of 100 acres each. The river, like the Nile, rises about the time of harvest and irrigates a large part of the land. Over against the district of the people of Ptolemy 5 at 11:7 issues into another river and this flows out into the sea. Other brooks, 6 as they are called, flow down into the Plaza and encompass the parts about Gaza and the one i.e. Ptolemy Philadelphus. 8. The text is doubtful. According to another reading we might translate when, the neighboring peoples retired, i.e. were gradually driven back by the Israelites. 1 cf. Exodus 12. 37, XXXIX. 3, LXX, Nurub. 1121. 100-acre man occurs frequently in the Petri papyri of the veterans of Ptolemy G, who received lots off land in the Fayyum. Cf. Joshua 3. I5. 5 Text, the country of the Ptolemies. Egypt, or mountain torrents. 48 The Letter of Aristeas 118 Region of Azotus. The country is encircled by natural defences, so that invasion is difficult and impracticable for large numbers, because the passes are narrow, being flanked by steep cliffs and deep ravines, and the whole mountain range which surrounds the entire country is of a rugged character. The mines of Arabia U9 We were further told that there were formerly copper and iron mines in the neighbouring mountains of Arabia. But these were stopped at the time of the Persian rule, as the overseers of those days spread a false report that 120 their working was unprofitable and expensive, in order to prevent the country from being spoiled for the sake of the mining of the said metals and possibly taken out of their hands as a consequence of the Persian overlordship, while by the help of this false report they found a pretext for entering the district. 1. V. Eleazar's farewell to the translators I have now given thee. Dear brother Philocrates, such a summary description of these matters as was necessary. The story of the translation we will tell in the sequel. I-21 Well, Eleazar selected the men of the best character and the highest culture, such as one would expect from their noble parentage. They were men who had not only acquired proficiency in Jewish literature, but had studied 122 most carefully that of the Greeks as well. They were therefore well qualified to be sent on embassies, and undertook this office whenever occasion required. They possessed one. The meaning of this section is obscure. The Letter of Aristeas 49 A great genius for conferences and discussions bearing on the law. They cultivated the due mean, the best of courses one, and while they abjured a harsh and uncouth disposition, they were likewise above conceit and the assuming of an air of superiority over others, and in conversation they were ready to listen and to give an appropriate reply to every question. And this bearing they all observed, and it was in such conduct that they most desired to outstrip each other, being all worthy of their leader and of his virtue. And one might see, in their 123 unwillingness to be torn from him, how they loved Eleazar and he them. For not only did he write to the king on the subject of their safe return, but he also earnestly besought Andreas to work for the same TND, and urged me to assist to the best of my 3 power. And although we promised to give good heed to his 124 wishes, he said that he was deeply distressed, for he knew how the king in his love of goodness considered it the greatest of privileges, wherever he heard of any one who surpassed his fellows in culture and wisdom, to summon him to his court. Indeed, I have heard of a 125 fine saying of his, that by having about his person just and prudent men he would possess the greatest protection for his kingdom, since friends unreservedly offer advice for one's best interests. And these qualities were assuredly possessed by the men whom Eleazar was now sending. And he kept asseverating on oath that he 126 would not let the men go, if it were merely some private interest of his own which impelled him so to do, but it was only for the common benefit to all his countrymen that he was sending them. For, he added, a good life 127 won with this praise of the mean cf 223 and 256. The writer clearly favors the peripatetic school. 2 lit. Us. 1 lit. R, D50. The letter of Aristeas consisted in the observance of the laws, and this end was attained much more by oral communication than by reading. From these and similar observations it was clear what were his feelings towards them. 6. Eleazar's apology for the Jewish law 12 grams. It is worthwhile briefly to mention the explanations given by him in reply to our inquiries. For I suppose that most men feel some curiosity about the regulations in the law 1 concerning meats and drinks and the animals 129 which are considered unclean. Well, when we inquired why, although there was but a single creation, some things are considered unclean for food, and some even to the touch, for the law is scrupulous in most things, but in these matters it is excessively too scrupulous, he began his reply as follows: 130 Thou seest, he said, what an influence is exercised by intercourse and association. By associating with evil persons men become perverted and are rendered miserable all their life long, whereas, if they consort with the wise and prudent, they pass from ignorance and amend 131 their lives. Our lawgiver, then, in the first place enjoined 3 piety and righteousness, and expounded them point by point, not merely by prohibitions but also by positive commands, making plain the harmful effects of disobedience and the visitations sent by God upon the 132 guilty. In the very first place of all he taught that God is one, and that his power is made manifest through all things, every place being filled with his sovereignty, and 1 cf Leviticus 11. Deuteronomy 14. 3-20. Compare the treatment of the same subject in the Epistle of Barnabas, I.O. Z. Text doubtful, perhaps doubly scrupulous. 3. Or laid down the principles of the letter of Aristeas 51. That none of the things done in secret by men on earth is hidden from him, but all that a man does and all things that are yet to be are manifest in his sight. When 133 he had carefully elaborated these points and made them plain, he shewed that even if a man should but think of acting basely, let alone the doing of the wrong, he could not be hid. Thus throughout the whole of the law he displayed the power of God. Beginning with these premises he went on to shew 134 that all other men except our nation consider that there are many gods, although they are themselves far more powerful than those whom they vainly reverence. For 135 they make effigies of stone and wood, 1 and assert that they are images of those who discovered something useful for their life, and these they worship, although their senselessness is obvious. 2 For that any one should thus 136 become a god in virtue of his invention is altogether foolish, for the inventors but took certain created things and put them together and shewed that they possessed a further use, but they did not create the substances themselves, therefore it is idle and vain. To 137 Deify men like themselves. Moreover, there are still at the present day many men more inventive and more learned than the men of yore, and yet they would never think of worshipping them. And the framers and authors of these fables consider that they are the wisest of the Greeks. What further need is there to speak of other 138 infatuated people, Egyptians and the like, who have put their trust in wild beasts and most of the creeping things and vermin, and worship these, and offer sacrifice to these, whether alive or dead. 1. The treatment of idol worship and its origin should be compared with Wisdom 13:15. Or although it is obvious that they, the images, are without feeling. 52. The Letter of Aristeas 139. When, therefore, the lawgiver, who was endowed by God to understand all things, had in his wisdom surveyed each detail, he fenced us about with impregnable palisades and walls of iron, to the intent that we should in no way have dealings with any of the other nations, pure in body and mind, released from vain ideas, reverencing the one Almighty God above the entire creation. For this reason the priests who lead the Egyptians and have closely investigated many things and been conversant with the world too call us men of God, a designation which does not belong to the rest of mankind, but to him only who reverences the true God. The rest are 141 men of meat and drink and raiment 3 for their whole nature finds solace in these things. But with our countrymen these things are counted of nothing worth, but their reflections throughout their whole life concern 142 the sovereignty of God. So then, lest we should become perverted by sharing the pollutions of others or consorting with base persons, he hedged us round on all sides with laws of purification in matters of meat and drink 143 and handling and hearing and seeing. 4. Speaking generally, all things to the natural reason are alike, being all governed by the self-same power, and yet in every detail there is a profound reason why we abstain from the use of some things and share in the use of others. For the sake of illustration I will run over 1 or 2 points and give thee an explanation. 144 Do not fall in with the rejected view that it was out of regard for mice and weasels 5 or such creatures 1 or the leading priests of the who have, etc. to let affairs. According to a conjectural reading literature, cf. Deuteronomy XXXIII. 1, etc. 3 lit. Shelter. 4 lit. Fallen down, perhaps degraded, Andrews. 5 le. 1129. Cf. ICOR 9. 9. R. The Letter of Aristeas 53 that Moses drew up these laws with such exceeding care. No, all these ordinances have been solemnly made for righteousness' sake, to promote holy meditation and the perfecting of character. For all the winged 145 creatures, of which we partake, are tame and distinguished by cleanly habits, feeding on wheat and pulse, such as pigeons, turtle doves, locusts, 1 partridges, geese 2 and all the like. But as touching the forbidden 146 winged creatures, thou wilt find that they are wild and carnivorous and use the strength which they possess to oppress the remainder of their kind and get their food by cruelly preying on the aforesaid tame creatures, and not on these only, but they also carry off lambs and kids, and do violence to dead men and living. By 147 these creatures, then, which he called unclean, to the lawgiver gave a sign that those for whom the laws were ordained must practice righteousness in their hearts and oppress no one, trusting in their own strength, nor rob one of anything, but must direct their lives by righteous motives, even as the tame birds above mentioned consume the pulse that grows on the earth and do not tyrannize to the destruction of their kin. By such symbols, then, the lawgiver has taught the 148 understanding to note that they must be just and do nothing by violence, nor oppress others in reliance on their own strength. For whereas it is not meet even to 149 touch the aforesaid creatures by reason of their several natures, what strict precautions must we not take to prevent the character from degenerating to a like condition? He 150 has, then, set forth all these rules as to what is permitted us in the case of these and the other creatures by way of allegory. For the parting of the hoof and the dividing 1 Leviticus 11. 22 Another reading names a species of moorfowl, 2 Deuteronomy 14. 1954 The Letter of Aristeas of the Clause 1 symbolize discrimination in our every 151 action with a view to what is right, for the strength of the whole body and its activity are dependent upon the arms 2 and legs. He constrains us, then, to do everything with discrimination and with a view to righteousness. Such is the signification of these symbols. 3 He 152 further signifies that we are distinct from all men. For most other men defile themselves by promiscuous unions, working great unrighteousness, and whole countries and cities pride themselves on these vices. For not only do they have intercourse with males, but they even defile mothers and daughters. 4 But we have been kept apart from these things. 153 Again, the lawgiver has characterized the possessor of the aforesaid quality of discrimination 5 as possessing also the gift of memory. 4 All things which part the hoof and chew the cud. 6 To thoughtful minds clearly 154 represent memory. For the chewing of the cud. 7 Is nothing else but a calling to mind of life and existence. 155 For he considers 8 that life exists by taking food. And therefore he gives exhortation by the scripture also, where he says thus, Thou shalt well remember the Lord who wrought in thee the great and wonderful things. 9 4 When clearly perceived, they do appear great and glorious, in the first place the construction of the body, and the means for digesting the food, and the distinction. 1 Leviticus 11. 3 ff. Deuteronomy 14. 6 ff. 2 lit. Shoulders. 3 Text doubtful. 4 The Egyptian custom of marriage with a sister is passed over without remark. 0 or separation. 6 Lev. 11. 3 1 Cfep of Barnabas Rn. 2, Philo, Despi, Leg. 4 5 Theodoret, Quaest. In Leviticus 11. 189 s or, reading the o.I, nm, life is wont to exist. 9 A combination of Deuteronomy 7. 18 and x21 lxx, the words in thee in the latter verse being here referrect to the humaq anatomy, in thy body. The letter of Aristeas 55 between the several members, but much more do the 156 or 2 RLY arrangement of the senses, the operation and invisible movement of the mind, and its rapidity in suiting its action to each several occasion and its discovery of the arts bear the marks of an infinite wisdom. 1 And therefore he exhorts us to bear in mind, how that 157 the aforesaid things are 2 both created and 2 preserved by the power of God. For he has appointed every time and place for the continual remembrance of God, the ruler and preserver. For instance, in the matter of 158 meats and drinks he bids us first to offer a part as a sacrifice, and not till then to partake of food. In our clothing, too, he has given us a symbol of remembrance. Likewise also he has commanded us to set the oracles upon our gates and doors, 3 that God may be had in remembrance, and he expressly orders that the sign 159 be bound round upon the hands, 4 clearly indicating that every action must be righteously performed with a remembrance of our creation, and above all with a fear of God. And he bids men when lying down and 160 when rising up 5 to meditate on the things which God has created, not in speech only, but reviewing also in thought the change and the impression which passes over them when they fall asleep, and the manner of their waking, how divine, as it were, and incomprehensible is the interchange of these states. 6 Thou hast now been shown the exceeding wisdom I61 of the saying 7 concerning discrimination and memory, according to our exposition of the parting of the hoof and the chewing of the cud. For the laws have not been made at random and capriciously, but with a view to 1 lit. Contain an infinite manner. Meaning doubtful, lit. Are preserved, with creation. 3 Deuteronomy 6. 9 Ibid 8. 5 Ibid 7. Cf. 213 to 216 and 3 Mace. v2. 7 Text doubtful, 56 The Letter of Aristeas 162 Truth and to point the way to right reason. For by his detailed injunctions concerning meats and drinks and touch he bids us do and hear nothing heedlessly, nor to resort to injustice by a misuse of the dominating power. 163 of speech. 1 In the case of the wild animals, 2, the same principle may be discovered. For the habits of weasel and mouse 2 and of all the like animals in the 164 aided are injurious. Mice mar and injure everything not only for their own food, but in such a way that anything which they have begun to injure becomes utterly useless. 165 For man. And the weasel tribe is peculiar, for beside the aforenamed habit it has a characteristic which defile it. It conceives through its ears and gives birth through 166 its mouth. 3 And therefore the like habit of man is unclean, that is to say, whenever they have embodied in speech the things which they have received through the ear and involved others in ills, they are guilty of gross uncleanness and are themselves utterly tainted with the pollution of their impiety. And your king, as we are informed, rightly puts such men to death. 167 And I said, I suppose that thou speakest of the informers, indeed he constantly exposes them to tortures and painful deaths. Yes, he replied, I speak of them. For to watch for 168 men's destruction is an unholy practice. And our law forbids us to injure any whether by word or deed. In my brief summary of these matters I have shown thee how every regulation has been made with a view to righteousness, and nothing has been set down in the scripture heedlessly or in a mythical sense but its purpose is that throughout our whole life we may in our one or the power of reason. 3 Leviticus 11. 29 A CFEP Barn. X8. Plus it. Fabulously. Another reading might mean capriciously, 1 The Letter of Aristeas 57 Actions exercise righteousness towards all men, remembering the sovereignty of God. So then all that is 169 said concerning meats and the unclean creeping things and wild animals relates to righteousness and righteous dealings between man and man. To my mind, then, he appeared one to make an excellent 170 defense in every particular. He added, moreover, with regard to the calves and rams and he-goats that are offered, that men must take these from the herds ahd flocks and sacrifice tame animals, and nothing that is wild, that so the offerers of the sacrifices, bearing in mind the symbolic meaning of the legislator, may have no arrogant thoughts upon their conscience. For he that presents the sacrifice makes an offering of his own soul and all its affections. I think that his discourse on 171 these matters was worth repeating, and therefore have I been led on, knowing thy love of learning, dear Philocrates, to explain to thee the sanctity and natural meaning of the law. 7. Reception of the translators at Alexandria. So Eleazar, when he had offered sacrifice and selected 172 the men and made ready many gifts for the king, sent us on our way in great security. And when we reached 173 Alexandria, the king was informed of our arrival. On our admission to the court, Andreas and I gave friendly greetings to the king and delivered the letter from Eleazar. The king was so anxious to meet the delegates 174 that he gave orders to dismiss all the other officials and to summon the men. This proceeding excited universal 175 1 Text amended, the MSS have he thought. QR inward, THE Act senses unsert 11 I, L, 58 The Letter of Aristeas surprise, because the custom is that those who come on official business gain access to the king's presence on the 5th day, while envoys from kings or eminent cities with difficulty secure admission to the court in 30 days. But since he considered the newcomers worthy of higher honor, and rightly estimated the eminent position of him who sent them, he dismissed those whom he considered superfluous, and remained walking to and fro, 176 waiting to greet them on their arrival. When they entered with the gifts which had been sent and they, precious, parchments whereon was inscribed the law in gold in the Jewish characters, the material being wonderfully prepared, and the joining of the several leaves being rendered imperceptible, the king, when he saw the men, 177 began to ask concerning the books. And when they had taken the rolls out of their coverings and unrolled the leaves, the king, after pausing for a long while and making obeisance some 7 times, said, I thank you, friends, and him that sent you still more, but most of all 178 do I thank God, whose oracles these are. And when all with one accord and with one voice, both the newcomers and the others who were present, exclaimed, /Vel spoken 20 King, he was moved to tears out of the fullness of his joy. For the strain upon the high-strung soul and the overwhelming sense of honor where 179 our achievements are successful constrained to tears. He bade them put the rolls back in their places, and then at length did he greet the men and say, it was right, 0 God-fearing men, first to pay homage to those treasures, for the sake of which I sent for you, and thereafter to extend the right hand to you. For that reason have I won. The word is absent from Josephus' paraphrase and should perhaps be omitted. Or well be it, God ith. King. The Letter of Aristeas 59 done this first. I regard this day of your arrival as a 180gr_8 day, and from year to year shall it be held in honor o our long life. Moreover, it happens to be the anniversary of our naval victory over Antigonus. 1 Therefore also it shall be my pleasure to sup with you today. All things, he added, shall be duly prepared 181 for you in accordance with your national customs, and for me with you. And when they had expressed their gratitude, he ordered that the best quarters near the citadel should be assigned to them, and the banquet made ready. 8. The banquet in honor of the translators. So Nicanor, the Lord High Steward, too summoned Doro 132 Theos, who had the charge of Gusts from this nation, and ordered him to make preparation for everything. For such was the arrangement decreed by the king, and it may still be seen to this day. To every state which has its special usages in matters of drink and meat and in its mode of reclining was there a corresponding official in charge, and then, whenever any person visited the reigning king, preparations were made in accordance with their customs, in order that there might be no discomfort to mar their enjoyment. This practice was followed in the case of these envoys. Dorotheus, the patron of 183 visitors from their nation, was scrupulously attentive. He laid out all the stores for the banquet which were in his keeping and were set apart for receptions of such guests. And he placed the couches in 2 rows, according to the king's instructions, for he had ordered him to 1 See Introduction, p. 9. 1 Tet amended, MSS the chief physician, 60 The Letter of Aristeas make half of the men recline at his right hand, and the remainder behind his own couch, neglecting no means of showing them honor. 184 When they had taken their places, he bade Dorotheus perform the customary rites of all his visitors from Judea. So he dispensed with the services of the sacred heralds and ministers of the sacrifices and the others who usually offered the prayers, and requested one of those who had come with us, Elisha, one the oldest of the Jewish priests, to offer a prayer. And he arose and 185 spoke these memorable words, May the Almighty God give thee thy fill, O King, of all the good things which he has created, and may he grant to thee and thy wife and thy children and to them that are of one mind with thee continual enjoyment of them while life 186 shall last. At these words there was a burst of applause with shouting and jubilation lasting for some while, and thereafter they betook themselves to the enjoyment of the banquet which had been prepared. All the attendance at table was undertaken by the staff of Dorotheus, among whom were royal pages and some of those who held places of honor at the king's court. 9. The wise answers of the translators. 137, 1. When, after an interval, an opportunity presented itself, the king asked him who occupied the first place at table, they were arranged according to seniority, how he 188 should preserve his kingdom unimpaired to the last. He paused for a moment and replied, Thou wilt maintain it most securely thus by imitating the never-ceasing gentleness of God. For if thou shewest long-suffering one so Josephus, the I_Ristes MSS call him Lizar, the Letter of Aristeas 61 and punishest such as deserve punishment more gently than one they deserve, thou wilt turn them from wickedness and lead them to repentance. 2. The king praised his reply, and asked the next one 189 how he should behave in all his actions. 2 And he replied that if he maintained just dealings with all men, he would act in all things for his best interest. 3 Considering that every thought is clear to God. By taking the fear of God for thy starting point, thou wilt never be disappointed. 3. To him too he gave his cordial assent, and asked 190 another how he could keep his friends like-minded with himself. And he said, If they see thee taking great forethought for the multitudes over whom thou rulest, and this thou wilt do by observing how God does good to the human race, in that he provides them with health and food and all else in due season. 4. He expressed his approval, and asked the next, 191 how when he held his audiences and sat in judgment, he might obtain a good report even from such as failed in their suits. And he said, If thou art impartial in speech to all alike and never dealest arrogantly nor tyrannically with offenders. And this thou wilt do if 192 thou beholdest the ordering of God's ways. The deserving have their petitions fulfilled, while to such as fail to obtain them the harmful nature of their requests is made known through dreams or events, and God does not smite them according to their sins nor according to the greatness of his might, but uses forbearance. 5. After highly commending him, he asked his nay 193 bore how he might be invincible in warfare. And he one text amended, MSS as they deserve. 2 or, inserting one word, do everything / or the best, Wendland. A text uncertain. Perhaps if he kept himself just towards all, he would act well upon every occasion. 1 cf 259, also PSCXLV. R5, CIV 27, Acts 14. 17, 17. 2562 The Letter of Aristeas said, if he did not put his trust in numbers or forces, but always entreated God to give success to his enterprises, while he himself discharged all his duties in a spirit of justice. 194, 6, he approved his reply, and asked the next one how he might inspire terror into his enemies. And he said, if while maintaining an abundant supply of arms and forces he recognized that these were powerless to produce any lasting and conclusive result, for God also, by granting reprieves and making but a display of his sovereignty one instills terror into every breast. 195, 7, he praised him, and inquired of the next what would be the highest good for his life. And he replied, to recognize that God is Lord of the universe, and that in our noblest achievements it is not we ourselves who successfully accomplish our intentions, but God in his sovereignty brings to fulfillment and guides the actions of us all. 196, 8, he admitted the wisdom of his words, and asked the next one how he could preserve all his possessions unimpaired, and finally transmit them to his descendants in the same condition. And he said, by continual prayer to God that thou mayest be inspired with good thoughts in thy undertakings, and by warning thy descendants not to be dazzled by fame or wealth, since it is God who bestows these gifts, and it is not on their own account that they have preeminence over all. 197, 9, he expressed his agreement with this answer, and inquired of him who followed how he should bear with equanimity whatever befell. And he replied, by taking thought that all men are fashioned by God to partake of the greatest evils, as well as the greatest blessings, and it is not possible for any human being to one text slightly amended. Cf. with the section Wisdom L. 2. 16-18 The Letter of Aristeas 63 have no part in them. But God gives a good courage, and we must beseech him / or the same. The king warmly commended him and said that all 198 their answers had been good. I will put a question to yet one more, he added, and then I will cease for the present, in order that we may turn our thoughts to the enjoyment of the feast and make merry. And in the following 6 days I will gain further enlightenment from each in turn of those who remain. 10. Thereupon he asked the man, what is the true 199 aim of courage? And he said, to carry out right counsels in the hour of danger in accordance with one's purpose. But thy counsels, O King, are good and are all fulfilled by God to thy profit. And when they had all signified their assent with loud 200 applause, the king said to the philosophers, of whom not a few were present, I think that the virtue of these men is extraordinary and their wisdom profound, seeing that, with such questions propounded to them, they have on the spur of the moment given suitable replies, and have all made God the starting point of their words. And Mendemus, the philosopher of Eretria once said, 201 True, O King, for, since the universe is ruled by providence and these men are right in holding that man is a creature of God, it follows that all power and beauty of speech proceed from God. The king assented thereto, and speeches ceased, and 202 they gave themselves up to festivity. And when evening drew in, the party broke up. On the following day the guests again took their 203 places and the banquet proceeded in the same order. When the king thought that the time had come to put 1c Introduction, p. 9. 64 The Letter of Aristeas inquiries to his guests, he proceeded to question those who were placed next to the men who had given answers on the previous day, 204, 11, he opened conversation with the 11th, 10 having been questioned on the previous day, and when silence was established, inquired how he could continue 205 to be rich. The man to whom the question was addressed paused for a moment and replied, if he did nothing unworthy of his rulership, never acted licentiously, never expended money on empty and vain things, but by acts of beneficence drew his subjects to wish him well, for God is the author of good things to all men, and man must needs follow his guidance. 206. 12. The king commended him, and asked of another how he should adhere to the truth. To this he replied, by recognizing that lying brings great disgrace upon all men, but chiefly upon kings. For as they have power to do what they will, what object have they for falsehood? And thou must further take to heart, 0 King, that God is a lover of the truth. 207. 13. He gave this reply his hearty approval, and looking upon another said, what is the teaching of wisdom? And the next one replied, as thou desirest that evils should not befall thee, one but to partake of all that is good, thou shouldst act in this spirit to thy subjects and to offenders, and shouldst very gently admonish such as are virtuous, for God draws all men to him by gentleness. 208. 14. He commended him, and asked of his neighbor how he might be humane. And he said, by observing after how long a time to and through what great sufferings one cf. The Jewish, negative, form of the golden rule, e.g. in the Didache I2. 2 or, with a slight emendation, with what trouble, Wendland. The Letter of Aristeas 65. The human race comes to maturity, and to the birth. Thou must not therefore on slight provocation punish or subject men to injuries, recognizing that human life consists of pains and penalties. Thou wilt then, taking all into consideration, be disposed to mercy, for God also is merciful. R5. With a word of approval to him he inquired of 209. The next in order, what is the most essential quality for a ruler to keep oneself incorruptible? He replied, to be sober for the greater part of one's life, to honor righteousness above all things, and to make friends of men of this character, for God also is a lover of righteousness. R6. He applauded him, and said to the next, 210. Wherein does piety consist? And he said, in the belief that God is working in and has knowledge of all things at all times, and that no unrighteous deed or evil action of man can escape his eye, for as God is the benefactor of the whole world, so wouldst thou, by imitating him, be void of offence. 17. He signified his assent, and said to the next, 2rr. What is the true aim of kingship? And he said, to govern oneself aright, and not to be carried away by wealth and fame into extravagant and unseemly desires, if thou wouldst reason aright. 2 For thou hast all things at command which are needful. 8. But God has need of nothing and is gentle with all. Let thy thoughts be such as become a man, and reach not after many things, but such only as suffice for thy kingly office. 18. He commended him and asked the next one how 212 his deliberations might be for the best. And he replied, 1 or essence, function. 2 Text apparently defective. Text amended, Wendland, MSS as nothing. E66 The Letter of Aristeas. If in everything he continually set justice before him and considered injustice to be equivalent to deprivation of life, for God also always promises the greatest blessings to the just. 213, 19, he praised him, and inquired of the next in order how he might be free from disturbing thoughts in sleep. And he said, thy question is hard to answer. For in sleep we cannot bring our true selves into play, but are then at the mercy of sensations in which reason 214 has no part. For we have an impression on our minds that we see the things which pass before us, but we are unreasonable if we think that we are indeed on shipboard and ranging over the sea, or flying through the air and passing to other climes, and doing other such things, 215 which we then suppose to be really taking place. 1 Howbeit, my conclusion, so far as I have reached one, is this. Thou shouldest by every means, 0 King, take piety as the governing motive of thy words and actions, that so thou mayest have the consciousness, while following the path of virtue, of never doing a favor in defiance of reason nor setting justice aside by an abuse of thy 216 power. For, as a rule, the mind is occupied in sleep with the same things in which its waking hours are spent, but every thought and action which is set towards the noblest ends is directed by God too, both in waking hours and in sleep. And therefore art thou always encompassed with tranquillity. 217, 20, him too he extolled, and said to the next one, as thou art the 10th to answer, when thy reply has been given, we will betake ourselves to the banquet. Then he asked, how can we avoid doing anything unworthy of one text emended? According to another emendation, and yet ye do suppose these things to be, etc. one text emended. The letter of Aristeas 67 ourselves. And he said, look ever to thy fame and 218 eminence, in order that thy words and thoughts may be in keeping therewith, knowing that all thy subjects think and talk about thee. For thou must not appear to be 219 worse than one the actors, for they look to the part which they must assume and suit all their actions thereto, but thou art not acting a part, but art king indeed, God having given thee the governorship which thy character merits. When the king had graciously applauded loud and 220 long, the guests were urged to take some rest. 2 And when the turn of these men was ended, they betook themselves to the next service in the order of the banquet. 21. On the following day the same order was 221 observed, and when the king thought that the time was come to put inquiries to the men, he asked the first of those who yet remained to be questioned, what is the highest form of government? And he replied, 222 to be master of oneself and not to be carried away by one's impulses. For all men's minds have some innate proclivity, probably most men are inclined to eating 223 and drinking and pleasure, while kings are bent on the acquisition of territory and great renown. 3 But moderation in all things is good. Take what God gives and keep it, but desire not what is beyond thy reach. 22. Pleased with his words, the king asked his 224 neighbor how he might be free from envy. And he, after a pause, said, chiefly by considering how it is God who apportions to all kings their glory and great one let least of the actors. Let. They urged the men to sleep. Apparently there has been some dislocation in the text. 3 Text slightly amended. 68 The letter of Aristeas wealth, and that no one by his own power one is king, for all men desire to partake of this glory, but they cannot, since it is a gift of God. 225, 23, he commended the speaker at some length, and asked the next one how he should despise his foes. And he replied, if thou hast studiously practiced goodwill towards all men and formed friendships, thou needest fear no man. But to be in high favor with all men is the very best of good gifts to receive from God. 226, 24, he commended his words, and bade the next one reply to the question, how he might retain his renown. And he said, if with loving kindness and gracious acts thou art liberal and bountiful to others, thou wilt never have lack of renown, but that the aforesaid graces may continue thine, thou must constantly call upon God. 227, 25, he bellied him, and asked another, with whom one should we vie in generosity? And he replied, all men think that we should be liberal to those who are well disposed to us, but I am of opinion that a keen and open-handed generosity is due to those who dissent from us, that by these means we may win them over to what is right and to their own interest. But one must entreat God that this end may be attained, since he rules the minds of all men. 228, 26, he assented thereto, and bade the sixth man reply to the inquiry, to whom should favor 3 be shown? And he replied, to parents at all times, since God has given a very great commandment concerning the honor due to parents. 5 And in the second place he sets the attitude of friend towards friend, one text slightly amended. 2 Possibly are. Or gratitude. 4 Or, the, greatest, cf. Ja cap 2. 27, and, for rabbinical parallels, I. Abraham's, Studies Z and Pharisaism, IP 26. 6 Exodus XX. 12 The letter of Aristeas 69 Calling a friend the equal of a man's own soul. 1 But thou dost well in making all men thy friends. 2:7 He spoke kindly to him, and inquired of the 229 following one, what is of like value with beauty? And he said, Piety, for this is a beauty of the first quality, and its power is love, which is God's gift. And this dost thou possess, and hast in it all blessings comprised. 28. He applauded his answer very warmly, and 230 asked of the next how, after a failure, he should regain the esteem which he enjoyed before. And he replied, Failure for thee is impossible, as thou hast sown the seeds of gratitude in all men, and these produce a crop of goodwill, which is mightier than the strongest armor and affords the greatest protection. But should any 2-3 fail, they should no longer do those things which occasion their failure, but form friendships and act righteously. But to be a doer of good deeds and not of the contrary is a gift of God. 29. Well pleased with this answer, he asked of the 232 next one how he might be free from grief. And he replied, By injuring no one, doing good to all, and following after righteousness, since its fruits produce freedom from grief. But supplication must be made to 233 God, that unforeseen accidents may not surprise and injure us, I mean such as deaths, diseases, pains, and the like. But, as thou art pious, no such misfortune will surely befall thee. 30. He commended him highly, and asked the 10th 234 man, What is the highest form of glory? And he said, To honor God, and that not with gifts or sacrifices, but with purity of soul and devout conviction that all things are fashioned and directed by God in 1 Deuteronomy 13. 6. LXX text. 70 The letter of Aristeas accordance with his will. And this is thy abiding belief, as all men may see from thy actions in the past and in the present. 235 Thereupon the king with a loud voice greeted them all and spoke kindly to them, the other guests, especially the philosophers, joining in the applause. For these men in their conduct and speech far outran the philosophers, in that they took God for their starting point. And after this the king proceeded to shew his kindly feelings by drinking the health of his guests. 236, 31. On the following day the order of the banquet was as before, and when the king's opportunity came, he began to question the men who sat next to those who had already responded. Of the first he asked, Can wisdom be taught? And he replied, The soul is so constituted that it can by divine power accept all that is good and reject what is contrary thereto. 237, 32. He expressed his assent, and inquired of the next one, What contributes most to health? And he said, Temperance. But this cannot be attained unless God dispose the mind thereto. 238, 33. He gave him a kindly word, and asked of the next how one should pay his debt of gratitude to his parents. And he replied, By giving them no pain, but this is impossible unless God becomes the mind's guide towards all that is best. 239, 34. To him also he gave his assent, and inquired of the next in order how he should become an eager listener. And he replied, By remembering that all knowledge is profitable, since it enables thee on an emergency to select and apply some one of the things which thou hast heard and to confront the crisis one with one text and meaning are doubtful. The letter of Aristeas 7 are the aid of God's guiding hand, for the fulfillment of men's actions rests with him. 35. He commended him, and inquired of the next 240 how he should avoid any action contrary to law. He replied thereto, If thou wilt recognize that it is God who put the thoughts into the hearts of the lawgivers to the end that men's lives might be preserved, thou wilt become a follower of them. 36. He approved his reply, and said to another, 241 What advantage does kinship bring? And he replied, The strength of kinship is apparent if we consider that we are the losers by the misfortunes which befall our kin and we make their sufferings our own. By such conduct 242 we shall win their esteem and underscore our place in their regard, for an active and kindly sympathy forms of itself an indissoluble bond in all circumstances. But in the day of their prosperity we should crave nothing of theirs but entreat God to give them every blessing. 37. He accorded a like approval to him as to the 243 others, and asked another man, How is fearlessness attained? And he said, When the mind is conscious of no wrongdoing, and God directs it so that all its counsels are good. 38. with a word of assent to him, he inquired of 244 another how he might have a right judgment always at command. He replied, if he constantly kept the misfortunes of men before his eyes and marked how God takes away prosperity and advances others to glory and honor. 39. He gave him his hearty approval, and requested 245 his neighbor for a reply to the question, how he might avoid a life of ease and pleasure. He replied, by bearing always in mind that he was ruler of a great kingdom and governor of vast multitudes, and that his 72 the letter of Aristeas mind must not be occupied with anything else, but devote its attention to their welfare. But he must ask God that none of his duties might be neglected. 246, 40, him too he commended, and asked the 10th man how he might detect persons who were dealing treacherously with him. To this he replied, by observing whether the bearing of those about his person was frank, and whether an orderly conduct was preserved one at receptions and councils and in general intercourse, and by seeing that the bounds of propriety were in no way exceeded in congratulations and in their whole 247 behavior. But God will guide thy mind, King, to what is best. The king applauded and praised them all, addressing each one by name, the other guests doing likewise, and they began to make merry. 248, 41, on the following day he waited for the right moment and asked the next in order, what is the grossest negligence? To this he replied, when a man is careless of his children, and does not devote every effort to their education. For our prayers to God are always not so much for ourselves as for our offspring, that every blessing may be theirs. But the desire that our children may be endued with sobriety comes through the power of God. 249, 42, he said that he had spoken well, and asked another how he might be a lover of his country. By keeping iri mind, he replied, that it is good to live and die in one's own land. Residence in a foreign one or perhaps the rule of precedence was observed. 1 lit. To sing, cf. Ichlas. XL 20, Slix. Is perhaps, with the omission of one letter, to live to see our children endued, etc. The letter of Aristeas 73 country 1 brings contempt upon the poor man and disgrace on the rich, as though they were in exile for a crime. If, then, thou bestowest benefits upon all men, as is thy constant habit, since God grants thee favor with all, thou wilt be accounted a lover of thy country. 43. After hearing him he inquired of the next one 250 how he might live amicably with his wife. By bearing in mind, he replied, that womankind are headstrong and energetic in pursuing their desires, and subject to sudden changes of opinion through fallacious reasoning, and weak by nature, and one must treat them sanely and not by opposing provoke a quarrel. For life is then 251 guided aright, when the steersman knows the port to which he must direct his course. But, if God's help be invoked, life is indeed at all times steered aright. 44. He admitted the wisdom of his words, and asked 252 the next one how he might be kept free from error. And he said, by always acting with gravity too and deliberation, and not giving credence to slanders, but testing for what is told thee, and pronouncing thy own judgment on the petitions submitted, and being guided by thy own judgment in granting them, so wilt thou be free from error, King. But to be of this mind and to live this life is a work which demands divine power. 45. He was delighted with these words, and asked 253 the next one how he might be free from wrath. To this he replied, by bearing in mind that he had power to do all things, even to inflict sentence of death if he gave way to wrath, and this were unprofitable and grievous that he should deprive many of life because he was Lord. 1 cf. The description of the humiliating life of the sojourner in HSXXIX. 22-28 text amended. 74 The letter of Aristeas 254 And where all were his subjects and none resisted him, to what end should he be wroth? And thou must know, he added, that God governs the whole world with kindliness and without anger at all, and thou must follow his example, King. 255, 46, he said that he had answered well, and inquired of him who came next, 1b. Herein does wise counsel consist. In doing all things well and with deliberation, he replied, not neglecting in our counsels to weigh one the injurious effects of following the opposite view, that so after considering every point we may be well advised and our purpose may be fulfilled. But, what is more important than all, by the sovereign power of God every resolution of thine will find fulfillment, since thou dost practice piety. 256, 47, he said that he, too, had answered rightly, and asked another, what is philosophy? It is to deliberate well over all contingencies, he replied, and not to be carried away by one's impulses, but to ponder the injuries which are the outcome of the passions, and to do the duty of the moment as it should be done, practicing moderation. But we must pray to God for a gift of a regard for these things. 257, 48, him, too, he applauded, and asked another how he might meet with acceptance when travelling abroad. By treating all men as thy equals, he said, and behaving rather as inferior than as superior to those among whom thou sojournest. For God alike too accepts the lowly disposition, and the human race also deals kindly with the humble. One literally comparing, i.e. with the advantages of the course adopted. 2 or for it is commonly found that, it is a recognized principle that, God, etc. The Letter of Aristeas 7:5, 49, he expressed his assent thereto, and asked 258 another how he could so build that his structures might endure hereafter. To this he replied, if his creations were on a great and majestic scale, so that beholders would spare them for their beauty, and if he neglected no one who wrought such works, and did not compel others to minister to his needs without pay. For if he 259 considered how God shews great consideration for the human race, supplying them with health and keenness of perception and his other gifts too, he himself would act likewise, by rendering to men the due reward for their arduous labours. For it is the works which are done in righteousness which also endure. 50, he said that he, too, had spoken well, and asked 260 the 10th, what is the fruit of wisdom? And he replied, to be conscious of no wrongdoing and to live a life of sense. Ity. For from these things thou 261 gainest the highest joy and a tranquillity of soul, most mighty King, and good hopes in God, while thou dost govern thy kingdom in piety. And all the company after hearing them expressed their approval with loud applause. Thereupon the king in the fullness of his joy turned to the drinking of healths. 51. On the following day the banquet proceeded in 262 the same order as before, and when the time was come the king questioned those who yet remained. And to the first he said, how should one keep oneself from pride? And he answered, by preserving a sense of 263 equality and reminding himself on all occasions that he was a man as well as a leader of men. And God 1-2 or cfs dismissed, 190. 76 The Letter of Aristeas putteth down the proud but exalteth the meek and humble. 264, 52, after a kindly word to him he asked the next in order, whom should one take for one's counselors? Those, he replied, who had been tried in many affairs and preserved a sincere loyalty towards him, and all who shared his principles. But, that these ends may be attained, God manifests himself to those who are worthy. 265, 53, he commended him, and asked another, what is the most necessary possession for a king? The good wishes and love of his subjects, he replied. For by these there is formed an indissoluble bond of loyalty. But it is God who causes these things to fall out as thou wouldest have them. 266, 54, he commended him highly, and inquired of another, what is the aim of oratory? And he said, to convince one's opponent, pointing out his errors in an attitude of deference. 2 For in this way wilt thou win over the hearer, not by direct contradiction, but by showing appreciation withal with a view to convincing him. But persuasion is attained through God's working. 267, 55, he said that he had spoken well, and asked another how he should live amicably with the many different races within his kingdom. By acting the proper part towards each, was his reply, taking righteousness for thy guide, even as thou dost, since God grants thee right judgment. 268, 56, he gave him his cordial thanks, and said to the next one, for what things should one be grieved? 1 Cf. Sam 2. 7f. Prov 3. 34, Luke I 51 f2 such, lit. By a subordinate position, I am now convinced is the meaning. Andrews, after Wendland, translates in well-ordered array of argument, the letter of Aristeas 77. To this he replied, for our friends' misfortunes, when we see that they are protracted and irremediable, reason does not permit us to be grieved for such as are dead and released from ills, yet all men do so grieve, thinking only of themselves and their own advantage. But to escape from every ill is possible only through the power of God. 57, he said that he had answered aright, and asked 269 another, how does ill repute arise? And he replied, when pride and unbounded self-confidence lead the way, dishonor and ruined reputation follow hard on their heels. But all reputation is at God's disposal, who assigns it where he will. 58, his reply also he endorsed, and asked the next 270 man to whom he should entrust himself. To those, he replied, who attend upon thee out of goodwill, and not from fear or self-interest, one making gain their sole motive. For the one is a token of love, but the other of ill will and time-serving, for the man who is bent on advancing his own interests is a born traitor. But thou hast the goodwill of all men, since God gives thee good counsel. 59, he said that he had answered wisely, and said 271 to another, what preserves a kingdom? To this he replied, care and watchfulness to see that no injury is inflicted by those who are set in positions of authority over the people. And such is thy practice, since God grants thee the gift of grave reflection. 60, he spoke encouragingly to him, and asked another, 272 what is it that maintains favor and honor? And he said, virtue, for it is the fulfillment of good works, and rejects what is base, even as thou dost preserve thy one literally consideration, either for their own interests, or, it may be, to gain thy consideration. 78 The letter of Aristeas perfect bearing towards all by the gift which thou hast from God. 273, 6r, he received his reply graciously, and asked the 11th, for their number exceeded 70 by 2, how even in warfare he might maintain a peaceful tranquility of soul. And he replied, by the consciousness of not having wronged any of thy subjects, and that all will fight in return for benefits received, knowing that even though they lay down their lives thou dost care for 274 their welfare. 1 For thou never failest to make reparation to any, such is the kind-heartedness which God has given thee. He loudly applauded and expressed his hearty approval to them all, and then drank a long draught to the health of each and gave himself up to enjoyment, sharing the men's society with merriment and high elation. 275, 62, on the 7th of the days the banquet was prepared on a larger scale, as many other visitors from the cities too were admitted, for a great number of ambassadors were in attendance. And when the time came the king asked the first of those who had not yet answered, how he might avoid being deceived by false reasoning. 276 And he said, by scrutinizing the speaker and his words and the subject of his speech, and by taking time and asking the same questions in different forms. But the possession of an alert understanding and the power of passing judgment in every case is a beautiful boon of God, and this dost thou possess, 0 King. 277, 63, the king loudly applauded, and asked another, why do most men not embrace virtue? Because, he replied, all men are by nature intemperate and hon/er after their pleasures, by reason of which things one led lives, i.e. their dependence. 2 Cfr 7:5. The letter of Aristeas 79 comes in justice and a sea of covetousness. But the 278 virtuous state checks those who are drifting into a life of self-indulgence and bids them prefer temperance and righteousness. But all this is under the direction of God. 64. The king said that he had answered well, and 279 asked the next one, whose guidance should kings follow? And he said, the guidance of the laws, that so by righteous dealings they may repair the lives of men, even as thou by such action hast laid the foundation of an everlasting memorial for thyself, through following the divine commandment. 65. He said that he also had spoken well, and asked 280 the next, whom should we appoint chief magistrates? 1. And he said, those who have a hatred of wrong and do what is just, imitating their rulers' conduct, to the intent that they may ever be in good repute, even as thou dost, he added, most mighty King, God having given thee a crown of righteousness. 2. 66. He loudly signified his approval and, turning to 281 the next one, said, whom should we appoint as officers over the forces? And he replied, those who are distinguished for bravery and justice and are more anxious for the safety of their men than to gain a victory while risking their lives in rash enterprises. For as God does good to all, so dost thou, making him thy example, do good to thy subjects. 67. He said that his answer was good, and asked 282 another, what man is worthy of admiration? And he said, he that is endowed with glory and riches and power and yet inwardly regards himself as on an equality. 1. The reply and the succeeding question show that 1 TPA.T1, and S is here used of a civilian official, the governor of a district of Egypt, 1 CF 2 Tim 4. 880 The letter of Aristeas with all men, even as thou by such action art worthily admired, since God grants thee a care for these things. 283, 68. To him also he gave his assent, and said to the next, upon what matters should kings spend most of their time? And he said, in reading and the study of the records of official journeys, one which are drawn up for kings, 2 with a view to the amelioration and preservation of the subjects. And by so doing thou hast won a renown beyond the reach of others, since God fulfills thy desires. 284, 69. The king spoke to him enthusiastically. 3. And asked another what he should take for his pastimes in his hours of relaxation and recreation. And he said, to watch plays which are played with propriety and to set before one's eyes scenes from life enacted with decency. And 285 Restraint is profitable to one's life and appropriate. For even in these matters some instruction is contained, since often by the most insignificant of things some desirable lesson is conveyed. But thou hast practiced all restraint and carriest thy philosophy into thy actions, while thou art honoured by God for thy perfect virtue. 286, 70. He was well pleased with these words, and said to the ninth, what should be one's conduct at banquets? And he said, thou shouldest invite such as are lovers of learning and able to suggest what may be useful to the kingdom and to the lives of thy subjects. No more. 287 Harmonious or sweeter music 5 couldst thou find. For these are beloved of God, since they have trained their minds in the highest learning. And such indeed is one. The papyri afford examples of the diaries or acta diurna officials in Egypt had to keep. Cf 298 INF 2 MSS Kingdoms. A text, lit. Actively equals emphatically, doubtful. Cf on the same topic Eclis. 916, XXXI. XXXIV, 12FF, 5, or perhaps nothing more harmonious or educative, which the letter of Aristeas 81 thy practice, since all thy actions are directed by God. 71. Delighted at his words, he inquired of the next 288 1, which is the best for the people, that a commoner should be set over them, one as king, or one born of royal blood. And he said, he who has the noblest nature. For some kings of royal lineage are inhuman and harsh. 289 towards their subjects, and much more is this true of some who have risen from the ranks, who after experiencing misery and a taste of poverty have, on becoming rulers of multitudes, proved themselves more cruel than the unholy tyrants. But, as I said before, a good 290 position which has had the advantage of culture is fitted to bear rule, even as thou art a great king, not so much through the preeminent glory of thy rule and thy wealth, as because thou hast outstripped all men in gentleness and kindness, since God has conferred these gifts upon thee. 72. He commended him at some length too, and asked 291 him who was last of all, what is the greatest achievement in the office of a king? To this he replied, if his subjects enjoy continual peace and get speedy justice done them when their cases are tried. And these results 292 follow when the governor is a hater of evil and a lover of good and makes much of the saving of a man's life, even as thou regardest injustice as the greatest of evils, and by thy just government in all things hast procured for thyself an imperishable renown, since God vouchsafes to give thee a pure mind untainted with evil. When his speech was ended, there was a burst of 293 applause with shouting and jubilation lasting for a good one. Text amended. MSS appointed by them to illossibly the words during a long time should be attached to the preceding speech. F82 The Letter of Aristeas while. And when this ceased, the king took a goblet and drank a toast in honor of all his guests and the speeches which they had delivered. And in conclusion he said, You have brought me the greatest of blessings 294 by your coming, for I have derived great benefit from the doctrine which you have laid down to guide me in my kingly office. And he commanded that to each should be given 3 talents of silver and the slave who should hand it to him. All the guests shouted their approval and the banquet became a scene of rejoicing, while the king gave himself up to a continuous round of festivity. 295 Now, if I have been too prolix one dear Philocrates, I pray thee to excuse this fault. For I admired beyond measure the way in which the men on the spur of the moment were ready with their replies which required much 296 meditation, and, seeing that their interrogator had carefully thought out each question, while the respondents one after the other had the task of replying thereto, they did indeed appear to me and to those who were present, but chiefly to the philosophers, deserving of admiration. And I believe that to all into whose hands this narrative 297 may come it will appear incredible. But to be untruthful in matters which are reported in the public archives is not meet. Were I even to pass over anything, it would be an act of impiety where such matters are concerned. No, we describe just what took place, conscientiously disclaiming all error. To this end, so much was I impressed with their powers of speech, I endeavored to obtain information from those persons who record in detail all that takes place at the king's 298 audiences and entertainments. For it is the custom, as thou art aware, to have a record kept of all that is said. One text amended. The Letter of Aristeas 83 and done from the hour when the king begins to give audience until he retires to rest, and the practice is a good and useful one. The next day, before any audience 299 is given, the minutes of the doings and sayings of the previous day are read through, and any irregularity which has occurred is corrected. \ve have, then, as we said, 300 obtained accurate information on all points from the public records one and have set it down here in writing, knowing as we did thy love of useful learning. X. The translation and its reception. Now after 3 days Demetrius took the men with 301 him and passing over the breakwater 7 furlongs 3 in length, to the island crossed the bridge and proceeded to the northern district. There he held a session in a noose which had been prepared by the seashore, magnificently built in a secluded situation, and bade them carry out their work of translation, since all the necessary appliances had been well provided. And so they 302 to carry it out, arriving at an agreement on each point by comparing each other's work. The appropriate rendering so agreed on was then transcribed under the direction of Demetrius. The session used to last until 303 the 9th hour, and thereafter they would depart to attend to their bodily comforts, all their wants being plentifully supplied. Moreover, Dorotheus used every 304 day to make the same arrangements for them as were made for the king, for he had the king's orders so to do. Every day at dawn they would come to the court, make one or from the keepers of the public records. The text is slightly amended. For the island of Pharos and the Heptastadion which connected it with the mainland see Strabo 17. 6, 792. SGR states cf 182. 84 The Letter of Aristeas their salutation to the king and depart to their own place. 305 And when, as is the custom of all the Jews, they had washed their hands in the sea and had offered a prayer to God, they betook themselves to the reading and 306 interpretation of each passage. Questioned them on this point, why it was that they washed their hands before praying. And they explained that it was in token that they had done no wrong, since the hands are the medium for all activity, in such a beautiful and pious spirit do they make all things symbols of righteousness and truth. 307 Thus, as we have said already, they assembled every day in this spot, which the peacefulness and brilliant light rendered so delightful, and carried on their appointed task. And so it came about that the translation one was accomplished in 72 days, as though this coincidence had been intended. I08 And when the work was ended, Demetrius assembled the Jewish people on the spot where the translation had been made and read it through to the whole assembly in the presence of the translators, who received another great ovation from the people in recognition of the great 309 services which they had rendered. And they gave a similar reception to Demetrius and requested him to have a copy of the whole law transcribed and to present 310 it to their rulers. And after the reading of the rolls the priests and the elders of the translators and some members of the Jewish community and the rulers of the people stood up and said, Forasmuch as the translation has been well and piously executed and with perfect accuracy, it is right that it should remain in its present 31R form and that no revision should take place. And when all had assented to these words, they too bade them, in one lit. Transcription 1 or, according to another reading, he, Demetrius, bade them. The letter of Aristeas 85 accordance with their custom, pronounce an imprecation upon any who should revise the text by adding to, or in any way transposing one or omitting aught from, what had been written, 2 And herein they did well, to the intent that the work might forever be preserved imperishable and unchanged. When word of these proceedings was brought to the 312 king, he greatly rejoiced, for it seemed that his purpose had been securely attained. The whole work was read through to him, and he was greatly astonished at the spirit of the lawgiver. And he said to Demetrius, How is it that none of the historians or poets ever thought of mentioning such great achievements? And he said, 313 Because the law is holy and has been given by God, and some of those who did essay to do so were smitten of God and desisted from their attempt. For he said 3q that he had beard Theopompus 3 tell HCW when he was too rashly intending to introduce into his history some of the incidents from the law which had previously been translated, for his mind was deranged for more than 30 days, and when the disorder abated he besought God that the cause of the misfortune might be made plain to him, and when it was shown him in a dream that his 315 desire to disclose divine truths to common men was misguided, he desisted and thereupon recovered his one or altering. 2 cf. Dent. 4:2, 12. 32, and for the imprecation Revelation XXII. R8 F3 Theopompus, the historian, lived from about 378 to 300 BC. About 305 BC he came to Egypt, but was not in favor with Ptolemy I, who would have put him to death as a dangerous busybody had not his friends interceded for bis life. It is interesting to compare this with the statement in Aristeas as to his meddling with divine matters, although the incident here related has probably no foundation in fact. Or perhaps when he was intending to introduce some of the incidents from the law which had previously been translated in a somewhat misleading way, cf. 20. 86 The Letter of Aristeas 316 Reason. I have been informed too, he added, by Theodex I the tragic poet, that when he was intending to introduce into one of his plays something recorded in the book 2 he was afflicted with cataract of the eyes, and, suspecting that this was the reason for his mishap, he besought God's mercy and after many days recovered his sight. LXI, the departure of the translators 317 The king, when he heard the explanation which Demetrius gave of this matter, as above narrated, made obeisance, and ordered that great care should be taken of the books, and that they should be guarded with 318 proper awe. He further besought the translators that after their return to Judea they would visit him very often. It was but right, he added, that they should now be sent home, but, should they visit him, he would in hounden duty treat them as friends, and they would 319 meet with the utmost consideration 3 at his hands. He ordered preparations to be made for their sending off and treated the men munificently. To each one he gave 3 of the finest changes of raimerit, and 2 talents of gold, and a sideboard 4 of a talent in weight, and all the furniture for the 3 couches of a dining 320 room. To Eleazar also he sent by the hands of their escort 10 couches with legs of silver and all the appurtenances thereof, and a sideboard 4 of 30 talents, and 1 Theodex, a rhetorician and tragic poet, a contemporary and on one occasion a rival of Theopompus, circa 375 to 334 NC. This seems to be the earliest use of f/f.os for a collection of sacred writings. 3 texts slightly amended, /iss Ricii rich presents, perhaps rightly, cf. ap. p. 103. Or covered in its literal sense, are Mace 15. J2. The MSS, omitting 1 letter, 1 add a small cup, the letter of Aristeas, and 7 changes of raiment, and a purple robe, and a magnificent crown, and 100 pieces of fine woven linen, and vials and dishes, and 2 golden bowls as a dedicatory offering. He wrote a letter also requesting him that if 321 any of the men should choose to return to him, he would not prevent them from so doing, for he counted it a privilege to enjoy the society of learned men, and would rather lavish his wealth upon such persons than upon vanities. 12. Concluding address to Philocrates. There, Philocrates, thou hast the whole story which 322 I promised thee. And indeed I believe that thou findest greater pleasure in these matters than in the books of the romancers, 1. For thou art devoted to the study of those things which can profit the mind, and art at most times occupied therewith. I shall, moreover, attempt to put on record whatever else is worthy of narration, that by the perusal thereof thou mayest win the fairest reward for thy zealous desire. 1. Or mythologist's appendix, the evidence of some ancient Jewish and Christian writers on the origin of the Septuagint version. A. Jewish, Rabbinic. I. Megillath T'Anith, the role of fasting. The calendar of fast days and festivals seems to have originated in Maccabean times, but received later additions from time to time. The present passage occurs in an appendix of fasts in Neubauer's edition, Anecdota Oxonianzia, Semitic Series, Vol. I, Part 6, Medieval Jewish Chronicles 2, Oxford 1895. J. On the 8th one day of Tevath 2 the law was written 3 in Greek in the days of King Ptolemy, and darkness 5 came upon the world for 3 days. 2. Masaketh so Pherim, the Tractate of the Scribes, I 7-10, ed. Joel Miller, Leipzig, 1878. A post-Talmudic treatise on the rules for writing the rolls of the law and kindred matters. Though not earlier than the 8th or 9th century AD, it includes 1 Oxford MS reads 7th. 2 The 10th month in TB Jewish year, equals December-January. 3 Mere transliteration of the Hebrew in Greek characters, not translation, may be intended. I.J., Ptolemy. Lit. The Darkness, CLEK. X2IF, 8990. Appendix Much ancient matter. The first of the 2 narratives below, with its unique reference to the 5, instead of the usual 70 or 72 elders, bears the marks of high antiquity. The second is of later origin and finds parallels in the 2 Talmuds and elsewhere. Of the 13 or more passages in the law, cited in this and the 2 following extracts, which are said to have been altered by the elders, 4 only appear in the altered form in our MSS of the LXX. 2 more of the variants are attested in African versions. Of the remainder, some are unmistakably, and all may be, mere variants in a Hebrew text, and it has been suggested, Frankel, Vorstudy N 31, that they were originally cited as readings in J. the Hebrew codex of the law presented to King Ptolemy, not in a Greek translation made from that codex. 7 TLZE law must not be written in ordinary Hebrew 1 nor in Aramaic nor in the Median language nor in Greek. A copy written in any foreign tongue or foreign characters shall not be used for reading in the services, but only one written in the Assyrian characters. 28 It happened once that 5 elders 3 wrote for the law in Greek for King Ptolemy, and that day was a hard day for Israel, like the day on which Israel made the golden calf. 5 Because the law was not capable of being interpreted according to all its requirements. 1 The older and common Semitic character used alike in ancient times by the L/Phoebites, Hebrews, Aramaeans, and Phoenicians, driver, notes on the Hebrew text F. Samuel, introd. I. 2 The later square Hebrew characters, 3 1 ms they wrote, omitting 5 elders, Frankt, über den Eingeluster Palast. Exeges, thinks that we have here a true tradition and that it is confirmed by indications, which he finds in the LXX text, that each book of the Pentateuch was rendered by a separate translator. Grat adopts this theory. This might refer to mere transcription of the Hebrew text in Greek characters. 5x, XXXII, Appendix GR. Again, it happened to King Ptolemy that he as 9 assembled 71 elders and placed them in 71 cells too, and did not make known to them wherefore he had assembled them, but he came into each of them in turn and said to them, Write me out the law of Moses your master. God put counsel into the heart of every one of them, that they were all of one mind, and they wrote out for him the law by itself. 3 But they altered 13 passages in it, and they are these: 5. 1. God created in the beginning. 6. 2. And God said, I will make man image and in likeness. 7. 3. And he finished on the 6th day and rested on the 7th. 8. 4. Male and female created he him. 9. 5. Go to, let me go down and there confound their language. 10:1 VL 70. 2. 2 Lit. Houses. 3. The writer emphasizes the limitation of their task to the law alone. 4. Actually 14 are cited. No. RO, omitted in the Jerus. Talmud, may be a later addition. 6. The last 4 words are omitted in some manuscripts. General I, instead of the order in the beginning created God, etc. The divine name occupies the first place. LXX keeps the usual order and, except as indicated, the normal text in the passages which follow. General I-26, instead of let us make in our image, after our likeness. The polytheistic plural is avoided. 8. General 2. 2. So LXX, instead of and on the 7th day God finished his work, etc. Text due to Sabbatarian scruples. General I-27, v2, instead of created he them, which words are omitted by one Egyptian version of LXX, the Bohairic. Trarlishan said that the first man, before the creation of Eve, was of reliable sex and had two faces. 10. General 11. 7. Instead of let us go down. Polytheistic plural again avoided. 92 Appendix 6. And Sarah laughed within herself saying, 1. 7. For in their anger they slew an ox, and in their self-will they uprooted a stall. 2. 8. And Moses took his wife and his sons and set them upon a bearer of men. 3. 9. Now the sojourning of the children of Israel, which they sojourned in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan and in the rest of the lands, was 430 years. 4. 10. And upon the Udim of the children of Israel he laid not his hand. 5. 11. I have not taken one desirable thing from them. 6. 12. And the short-footed one. 7. 13. Which the Lord thy God hath divided to one general. 18. 12. A mere difference by one letter in the spelling of the Hebrew word laughed, perhaps to distinguish Sarah's laughter from Abraham's. General 17:17. General Slicks. 6. For they slew a man. They hung an ox. The alteration, made from a desire to clear Levi of manslaughter, has perhaps affected the Ethiopic version of LXX, cities for an ox. Astal, Ebus. Friedman suggests an allusion to Apis and Egyptian idolatry. 3x, 4. 20, 4 upon an ass. Alteration from regard to Moses' dignity. LXX upon the beasts of burden. EX 12. 40, and in the land of Canaan and in the rest of the lands inserted on chronological grounds. LXX has part of this, and in the land of Canaan, with the further addition, in many MSS, they and their fathers. 5x, XXIV. 2, 4 and upon the nobles, etc. The Hebrew word occurs here only in this sense, lit. Corners, so supports. The meaning of Zauim is obscure, probably it is a transliteration of the gr zethai, equals commissioners, or zaetai equals diamtai, arbitrators. LXX, the elect, does not help to explain it. 6 num xd. 15, for 1 as. LXX has this variant, desirable thing, the Hebrew word differs from as by a slight change in one letter. 7 read, with a change of one letter, the hairy-footed one. Deuteronomy 14. 7, cf Leviticus 11:5f, and the hair, Hdnubith, LXX the hairy-foot de sopoda, the later Greek name for the hair instead of the c, lasical word ta, versus se further on this word below. Appendix 93 Give light unto all the peoples under the whole heaven, 1, R4, which I have not commanded them to serve, 2 they do not write T/1 law in gold letters. It hap ro penned in the case of the copy of their law which went to them of Alexandria 3 that A11 the divine names were written in gold, and when the matter came before the wise, they said, put it away. 6, 3, Talmud of Jerusalem, Palestinian Talmud, Megillah I-71d, bottom, cf Mechilta on Exodus 12:40, 13 passages were altered by the wise for King Ptolemy. They wrote thus for him. Then follow the passages cited in the previous extract, except that no ro is omitted, the order of nos. 3, and 4, is transposed, as also of rr, and 12. No. 12, here no. 10, appears in the following form, smiley face, and for the hair Ha'arnebeth they wrote the short-footed one. 6 the name of the mother of King Ptolemy was Ernebtha. 7, 4, Talmud of Babylon, Megillah 9a. The preceding Mishnah, after stating that the books of scripture may be written in any foreign language, 1 Deuteronomy 4. 19 the words to give light are added to emphasize the fact that the luminaries were not given to be worshipped. 2 Do. 17:3. The addition of the words to serve is similar to that in the previous passage. It appears in CNE Egyptian version made from the LXX, the Bohairic/ACIE. 3 Another reading to Alexander. 4 Lit. Mentions, allusions, to the name. 5 i.e. in the Geniza, or synagogue lumber room, as unfit for use in the services. Cf. Aristeas, 176, where the whole of the MS is said to have been written in gold. 0 Read the hairy-footed one, see above. 7 See note on the next extract. 94 Appendix adds the stricter ruling of Rabbi Simon ben Gamaliel that they might be written only in Greek. Rabbi Jehuda said that the permission of our rabbis as to writing in Greek extends only to the book of the law, and that because of what happened in the case of King Ptolemy. We are taught thus when it happened to King Ptolemy that he assembled 72 elders and collected them in 72 cells 2 and did not reveal to them wherefore he had assembled them, but he came iri to each of them in turn and said to them, Write me out the law of Moses your master. The Holy One, blessed be he, put counsel into the heart of every one of them, that they were all of one mind, and they wrote for him as follows. Then follow the 14 passages quoted in LL M, above, to which is added a 15th, between nos. 9, and 10, viz. And he sent the Zau/im of the children of Israel. 3 other variations from Mos. Sophomore are that to passage. 4, the note is added and they did not write, he created them, in passage. 9, the words and in the land of Canaan are not inserted, and the number of the years is, in some MSS, 400, and passage. 12, which here occupies the 15th and final place, appears in the following expanded form, smiley face, and they wrote for him the short-footed one, and they did not write for him the hair Ha'arnebeth, because of the wife of Ptolemy, whose name was Arnebeth, lest he should say, the Jews have one, i.e. there is a tradition, outside the Mishnah. 2 Lit. Houses. 3 EXXXIV. 5, 4 And he sent young men, etc. See note on passage, RN, under Mos. Sophomore, above. 4 ZA/U, I'm Appendix 95 mocked me by introducing the name of my wife into the law. 1, B, Jewish, Hellenistic. 5, Pseudo, Aristobulus, as cited by Eusebius, Preparation for the Gospel, 13:12. The work, of which this fragment, with a few others, has survived, consisted of an allegorical and philosophical explanation of the Mosaic Law. It purports to have been addressed to King Ptolemy Philometor, 182 to 146 BC, but its claim to so high an antiquity has, like that of the Letter of Aristeas, been disputed by many recent critics. It is evident that Plato was a follower of our code of laws, evident too that he diligently studied all their details. For before the time of Demetrius of Phalerum, before the dominion of Alexander and of the Persians, a translation had been made by others of the narrative of the leading forth of the Hebrews, our fellow countrymen too out of Egypt, and of the divine manifestation in all which befell them, and of the occupation of the promised land. We have here a curious distortion of an older story attaching to the LXX word for hair, dasypus, hairy foot. Doubtless the original explanation was that the translators avoided the classical word, lagas, for the unclean animal, because it might be construed as a reflection on the name of Lagos, the father of Ptolemy I, and on the dynasty of the Lagidi. The story was forgotten and another confused explanation took its place. Sephirim gives the LXX rendering without comment. In the Jerusalem Talmud the king's father is replaced by his mother, and she again in the Bab Talmud by his wife, and the point of the story is now found apparently in a resemblance between the Hebrew word for hair, Arni Beth, and the royal name Arsinoe, to lit. Fellow, citizens. 96 Appendix with a detailed statement of the entire law. 1. It is thus abundantly clear that the aforesaid philosopher has derived many things theory from, for he was a man of great learning, like Pythagoras, who also borrowed many of our doctrines and incorporated them in his decrees. But the complete translation of the law and all its contents was made under the king surnamed Philadelphus, thy true ancestor, who displayed the greatest zeal. 3. While Demetrius of Phalerum busied himself with the necessary arrangements. 6. Philo, on the life of Moses, 2. 5-7. 5. The admiration in which the reverend law has been held, not by Jews alone but also by the rest of the world, is evident alike from what has already been said and from the story which I proceed to tell. In the olden days the laws were written in the Chaldee tongue, and for a long while so they continued without any change in their language, when as yet they had not displayed their beauty to the rest of men. But when, through the constant daily study and practice of these laws by their followers, others also awoke to a knowledge of them, and their fame spread far and wide for beautiful objects, though for a while they may be obscured through envy, by a kindly law of nature again in due season recover their brilliance. Certain persons feeling aggrieved that the laws should find a place with half only, the non-Hellenic 6 portion, of the human race, while the Hellenic half should have no share in them. Whatever, applied 1. The alleged pre-Septuagint version is represented as comprising at least portions of the last 5 books of the Hexateuch. 2. Ptolemy 7, Philometor, is addressed 3 or greater ambition, viz. Than the earlier translators, i.e. Hebrew. Philo uses the words Chaklian and Lebriko indiscriminately. Lit. Barbarian Appendix 97 themselves to their translation. And since the task was great and for the general good, it was entrusted not to common folk nor to ordinary rulers, whose number is legion, but to kings and to the most notable among them. Ptolemy, surnamed Philadelphus, was the third in the dynasty which dated from Alexander I the conqueror of Egypt, and in the kingly virtues surpassed not only the monarchs of his time but all who ever were before him. To this very day, so many generations later, the fame is sung of him who left, throughout cities and countries, such abundant evidences and memorials of his magnanimity, insomuch that it has now become almost a proverbial saying to describe acts of exceeding munificence and buildings on a mighty scale, after his name, as Philadelphian. In short, the house of the Ptolemies flourished above all other kingdoms, and among the Ptolemies Philadelphus ranked highest. The united achievements of all the rest hardly equaled the laudable deeds of this one monarch. He was like the directing mind in a living organism, the head, as it were, of the kingly body. Such, then, was the man who, conceiving a passion 6-8 desire for our code of laws, proposed to have the Chaldee rendered into the Greek tongue, and straightway sent ambassadors unto the high priest and king of Judea, for the same man held both offices, to declare his will and to exhort him to select according to their merits persons to translate the law. And he, with natural delight and supposing that the king's zeal for so high a task was not uninspired by divine providence, looked out the most approved of the Hebrews who were with him, men who had been trained in the Hellenic one lit. Third from Alexander, i.e. his second successor. 2 i.e. Hebrew, as above. G98 Appendix Learning in addition to that of their country won and gladly dispatched them. On their arrival they were invited to a banquet and entertained and feasted their host in return with clever and earnest speeches. Point 2 For he made trial of each man's wisdom, propounding novel and unusual questions, while they, the occasion not permitting of a long discourse, solved the conundrums which were put to them with the ready sagacity and pointed repartee of the speaker of terse apothegms. After passing this scrutiny, they proceeded straightway to discharge the duties of their honorable embassy, and reflecting with one another upon the magnitude of the task of giving an oracular interpretation of divinely inspired laws, being under constraint neither to detract aught nor to add nor to transpose three but to preserve their original form and type, they looked for the purest spot in Tl1e district, without the city. For the parts within the walls, being full of living creatures of all sorts, were, by reason of diseases and deaths and the unholy actions of those in sound health, viewed with suspicion. The island of Pharos lies in front of Alexandria, its neck of land with half-submerged sandbanks stretches along over against the city and is washed by a sea which is not deep close inshore but for the most part consists of lagoons, so that the mighty roar and crash of the waves breaking a very great distance away are deadened. This spot out of all the surrounding district they selected as the most suitable haven wherein to find peace and quietness and for solitary communion between their souls and the laws. So here they abode, and taking the holy books they extended their hands with them to heaven, entreating God that they might not fail in their purpose. And he 1 cf. Arist. 121. Philo, it is to be observed, names no number. Arist. 187 ff 3 cf. Arist. 310 f Appendix 99 granted their prayers, in order that the more part, or indeed the whole, of the human race might reap the benefit of access, for the amendment of life, to our wise one and holy excellent ordinances. In secret they sat, with none present save the seven elements of nature: earth, water, air, heaven, whose origin it was their first task to expound, for the cosmogony holds the first place in our laws, and, as men possessed, they produced not divers interpretations, but all alike used the same words and phrases, as though some invisible prompter whispered in the ears of each. And yet who does not know that every language, and Greek beyond all others, is rich in words, and that one may by circumlocution and paraphrase clothe the same thought in divers forms, varying the style to fit the occasion? Yet this, they say, did not happen with these laws FRs. No, the appropriate technical words T and the translation corresponded exactly with the technical words in the original, the Greek with the Chaldee too being admirably adapted to fit the subject matter. Just in the same way, I suppose, as in geometry and dialectics, the meanings of the terms used do not admit of any variety of definition, but that which is laid down in the first instance is retained throughout, so, it seems, these men discovered the words which coincided with the subject matter and which were alone, or most nearly, capable of rendering the sense transparently clear. The surest proof of the foregoing statement is this. If Chaldeans too learn Greek or Greeks Chaldee too and they read both writings, the Chaldee too and the translation, they are filled with amazement and veneration for what appear as sister writings or rather as one and the same work one lit. Philosophical. 1 degree. E Hebrew, I Ilruz, IOO Appendix as regards both subject matter and phraseology, and they call those men not translators but priests of the mysteries and prophets, to whom it was vouchsafed with sincerity of mind to enter into one the spotlessly pure spirit of Moses. For this cause there is held to this day every year a festival and public assembly on the island of Pharos, to which not Jews only but multitudes from other nations cross the water, to pay reverence to the spot on which the translation first shed its light, and to give thanks to God for a benefit, ancient yet ever new. After the prayers and thanksgivings some pitch tents on the seashore, while others recline on the sand, and all keep feast in the open with relatives and friends, regarding the beach on that occasion as more luxurious than a royal palace. So desirable and highly to be prized do our laws appear to all alike, whether commoners or rulers, and that though for a long time the fortunes of the race have been at a low ebb, and nations that are not at their prime are wont to suffer eclipse. If, then, there should come an opening to a brighter future, what an advance may we not hope will be made. 2. I suppose that all nations would forsake their own customs and bidding farewell to their country's laws would come to pay honor to these laws alone, for with the revival of the nation's fortunes they will recover their brilliance and rob others of their brightness even as the sun at his rising blots out the stars. 7. Josephus, A. Jewish Antiquities, I3, 10-12, Nis. I found that the second of the Ptolemies, a king who was zealous beyond all others in the cause of learning one lit. Run, O keep pace, with CFROM 11. R2. Appendix IOI and in the collecting of books, had a special ambition to produce a version in the Greek tongue of our law and the polity which is ordered in accordance therewith. I found too that Eleazar, who came behind none of our high priests in virtue, did not grudge the aforesaid king the enjoyment of this benefit, which he would doubtless have denied him, had it not been the custom of our nation to keep no good thing a secret to themselves. I considered accordingly that it became me also to imitate the high priest's magnanimity and to suppose that even now there are many who share the king's love of learning. For even he did not obtain the whole record and so forestall me, since it was the law alone which was delivered him by those who were sent to Alexandria as interpreters. B. IB 12. 2 I. Alexander reigned 12 years, and after him Ptolemy Soter 41 years, and then Philadelphus succeeded to the throne of Egypt and occupied it for 39 years. He translated the law and liberated from bondage those of the inhabitants of Jerusalem who were bondsmen in Egypt, in number about 120,000, on the following grounds. Then follows a free paraphrase of a large part of the Letter of Aristeas. C. Christian. 8. Justin, Apology, L3R. Now when Ptolemy, the king of the Egyptians, was forming a library and endeavored to make a collection of all men's writings, he heard tell, among the rest, of these prophecies, and sent to Herod who was then king of the Jews with a request that the books of the IOZ appendix prophecies might be transmitted to him. And King Herod sent them, written in their native Hebrew tongue of which I have spoken. But, since the Egyptians were unacquainted with the things written therein, he sent yet again and requested him to dispatch men to render them into the Greek language. This was done and the books remained with the Egyptians and are there to this day. 9. Pseudo-Justin, Exhortation to Greeks, 13. Ptolemy, king of Egypt, formed a library in Alexandria and collected books from every quarter and filled it. Then, learning that certain ancient histories written in Hebrew characters had been preserved with scrupulous care, and being desirous to know what was written therein, he sent to Jerusalem for 70 wise men, who were familiar with the speech of both Greeks and Hebrews, and bade them translate the books. And, in order that they should be free from all disturbance and the sooner complete their task, he gave orders for their accommodation not in the city itself, but 7 furlongs one away, where the Pharos too was built, and that little cells, in number as many as the translators, should be erected there, to the end that every man should execute his translation apart by himself. He charged the attendant ministers to see that they wanted for nothing, but to keep them from communicating with each other, in order that their agreement might afford a further proof of the accuracy of the translation. When he found that the 70 men had not merely expressed the same ideas but had employed the very same phraseology, and had not so much as in a single word failed to agree with each other, but had written on the same themes in the same language, he 1gr, stayed /2 i.e. the lighthouse on the island, Appendix 103 was amazed, and, believing that the translation had been written by divine power, he recognized that they merited every honor, as men beloved of God. So he bestowed many presents one upon them and bade them return to their own country, the books, as he was like to do, too he held to be divine and laid up in his library. These things which we declare unto you, men of Greece, are no myths nor fictitious history. We ourselves have been in Alexandria and have seen the traces, still preserved, of the cells in the island of Pharos, and have heard this story which we tell you from the inhabitants, who have had it handed down as a tradition of their country. You may learn it from others also, and chiefly from those wise and distinguished men who have written of it, Philo and Josephus, but there are many others besides. 10. Jairenius, Against All Heresies, 3. XXI 2. Before the Romans had established their empire and when the Macedonians were still masters of Asia, Ptolemy son of Lagus, in his ambition to adorn the library which he had built in Alexandria with the writings of all men, such at least as were of merit, besought of the inhabitants of Jerusalem that he might have their scriptures rendered into the Greek tongue. And they, being at that time still subject to the Macedonians, sent of their number those who were most proficient in the scriptures and in both languages, 70 elders, to Ptolemy to do his will. 3. The king, desiring to make trial of them privily, and fearing lest by some mutual covenant 1 cf. Arist. 318, with the MS reading. 2. Or, as was meet. Or, according to another reading, God having wrought that which he desired. 104. Appendix. They might through their translation conceal the truth contained in the scriptures, separated them from each other and commanded the whole company to translate the same portion of scripture, and this he did with all the books. Now when they were assembled together in Ptolemy's presence and compared every man his translation with his neighbor's, God was glorified, and the scriptures were recognized as indeed divine, in that they had all expressed the same things by the same phrases and the same words from beginning to end, insomuch that even the Gentiles who were present perceived that the scriptures had been translated through the inspiration of God. For it was one and the self-same Spirit of God, who in the prophets proclaimed what and in what manner should be the coming of the Lord, and in the elders interpreted well what had been well prophesied. R.R. Clement of Alexandria, Stromates, I. R. 48, 409 p. Based on Irenaeus, or a common source, and Aristobulus. They say that the scriptures, both of the law and of the prophets, were translated from the Hebrew tongue into Greek under King Ptolemy, son of Lagus, or, as some assert, under him who was surnamed Philadelphus, Demetrius of Phalerum, displaying the greatest zeal in this undertaking and carefully supervising the details of the business. It was in the days when the Macedonians were still masters of Asia that the king was fired with the ambition to adorn the library which he had founded in Alexandria with all manner of writings, and among other requests asked the men of Jerusalem to translate the prophecies in their keeping into the Greek tongue. Appendix 105. And they, being still subject to the Macedonians, 149 selected from the most renowned among them 70 elders, skilled in the scriptures and acquainted with the Greek language, and sent them to him with the sacred books. Each man in turn and apart translated each several prophecy, and all the translatio_ns when compared conspired together both in thought and diction, for the will of God had been one attuned to 2 tons Greek ears. And surely it was not strange that the inspiration of God who had given the prophecy operated to make of the translation also as it were a Greek prophecy, seeing that, when the scriptures had perished in the captivity under Nebuchadnezzar, in the days of Artaxerxes, the king of the Persians, Esdras the Levite and priest was inspired to revive and to prophesy afresh all the ancient scriptures. 1-2, Tertullian, Apology, 18. The most erudite of the Ptolemies, whom they surname Philadelphus, and one who was most deeply versed in all literature, when in his passion for collecting books he was, I suppose, emulating Pisistratus, among other records whose title to fame was due to their antiquity or some curious lore, besought the Jews also for their own literature, of which they were the sole possessors, in its native tongue. This he did on the suggestion of Demetrius of Phalerum, the most eminent philologist of his time, to whom he had entrusted the superintendence of the volumes. For at all times prophets had arisen from among them and had pleaded with them, as being a nation who in virtue of the favor shown to their fathers were God's own peculiar people. Those who won Wendland amend, for by the will of God they the translatitians had been, etc. or studied or rehearsed for. Meaning of doubtful. I-06 Appendix are now Jews were once Hebrews, and consequently had their Hebrew characters one in language. To guard, however, against misunderstanding, Ptolemy had further placed at his disposal by the Jews the services of 72 translators, whom even the philosopher Mendemus, the upholder of providence, regarded with esteem on account of the opinion which they held in common with himself. 2. You have confirmation in this in what Aristeas has stated. Thus the king left the records in Greek and accessible to all. 3. To this day the libraries of Ptolemy are shown in the Serapeum with the actual Hebrew documents. R3. Anatolius, Canons concerning the Passover, as quoted by Eusebius, Ecclesiastes History, 732. The writer, an Alexandrian by birth, and in the latter part of the 3rd century bishop of Syrian Laodicea, among other authorities on the method of calculating the time of the Passover, mentions the famous Aristobulus, who was enrolled among the 70 who translated the holy and divine scriptures of the Hebrews for Ptolemy Philadelphus and his father. He also addressed to those same kings books in which he expounded the meaning of the Mosaic Law. R4. Usprins, Preparation / or the Gospel, 8. 1. Before calling my witnesses, I think it necessary to explain to my readers how the oracles of the Hebrews passed into Greek hands, the manner of the translation of the divine scriptures with which that nation had been entrusted, the number and nature of the translators, and the royal zeal which brought about the version into the one or literature. 2. Cf. Arist. 201. 3. The sentence might possibly mean he, i.e. Aristeas, has left records to this effect in Greek, etc. Appendix Greek tongue. The narrative will not fail to contribute to my demonstration of the preparation for the Gospel. When the time was close at hand in which, under the Roman Empire, the salutary preaching concerning our Saviour was destined to shed forth its light upon all men, and there was thus an exceptional and imperative reason why the prophecies concerning him and the life of the divinely favoured Hebrews of old and the lessons of their pious teaching, which for long ages had been veiled in their country's language, should now at length be transmitted to all the nations, who were to be introduced to the privileges of a knowledge of God, God Himself, the author of these benefits, anticipating the future with divine foreknowledge, providentially ordained that the predictions about Him who was shortly to appear as Saviour of all men and to become for all nations under the sun the teacher of pious worship of the one supreme God, should, by means of an accurate version deposited in public libraries, be revealed to the world and come to light. It was King Ptolemy into whose heart he put it to fulfill this task, in preparation, it would seem, for the impending time when all nations would participate in these blessings. For to those treasures which we should not otherwise have wrested from the Jews, who through envy of us would have concealed their oracles, to these we gained access. Through the translation, dispensed by divine providence and executed by men who for wisdom and learning in their country's lore were held in high repute by their nation. The story is told by Aristeas, a man of exceptional erudition, who moreover took part in the events which happened under the second Ptolemy, surnamed Philadelphus. For it was in his reign and through his zeal 108 appendix that the translation of the Jewish scriptures was produced and deemed worthy of a place in the libraries of Alexandria. But it is time to let our author speak for himself in his own words. Extracts from the letter here follow. 15. Chrysostom, Homilies on St. Matthew, v2. The 70 may justly be deemed more trustworthy than the rest of the translators. The others translated after the coming of Christ, continuing to be Jews, and might with justice be suspected of having spoken rather from enmity and of obscuring the prophecies of set purpose. But the 70, in that they approached their task 100 or more years before the coming of Christ too and were so many, are above all such suspicion, and by reason of their date, their number, and their agreement may well deserve the greater credence. 16. Epiphanius, on weights and measures, 3-11. This diffuse and diverting account in his credulity Epiphanius is like another Herodotus among the Egyptian priests is interspersed with references, here omitted, to the later Greek versions of Aquila, etc., and to the symbols used in Origen's Hexapla. The portions enclosed in brackets, occur only in the Syriac version edited by Lagarde. 3. They were 72 in number and were shut up from morn till eve in the Pharian island, in the region 1 with a slight emendation we might read in that they came to the same result, i.e. produced identical versions. 2. In his homilies on Genesis, 4. He puts the translation under a certain King Ptolemy not many years before the corning of Christ. Other dates mentioned are 230 BC, P.S. Athanasians, Synopsis, 31 BC, P.S. Theodoret, and 301 BC, Nistus, Catena on the Psalms. Appendix 109 called the Upper Country won over against Alexandria, in 6 and 30 cells, 1 pair in each cell. At even they would cross over in 36 skiffs to the palace of Ptolemy Philadelphus and feast with him. They slept in pairs in 36 bedchambers. Such was the life they led, to the end that they should have no collusion with each other and should produce an unadulterated translation. The 36 cells which I mentioned were erected by the aforesaid Ptolemy in the island across the water. He made them in 2 compartments 2 and shut in the men 2 and 2, as I said, and he shut in with them 2 ministering attendants to cook and to wait upon them, and they had shorthand writers 3 in addition. He did not so much as make windows in the walls of those cells, but had what are called skylights opened in the roofs above their heads. So they lived from morn till eve under lock and key, and so they translated. To each pair 1 book was delivered, that is to say, the book of the Genesis of the world to 1 pair, the Exodus of the children of Israel to a 2nd pair, Leviticus to a 3rd, and so on. Thus were translated the scriptural and canonical 5 books, 27 in all, or 22 if the reckoning is made to correspond to the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Thus then were translated these 7 and 5 20 books, also reckoned as 2 and 20. They included the Psalter and the additional matter in Jeremiah, I mean his Lamentations and the epistles of 1 cf. Arist. 3 or, the Northern District. 2 gr. double. 3 or ready scribes for Greek shorthand C. Milligan, NT documents, note C 4 cf. Arist. 307, brilliant light, lit. Down shining. 6 lit. In the Testament. I-10 Appendix Baruch, although with the Hebrews the epistles find no place and the Book of Lamentations is the only writing attached to Jeremiah. The method was as already described. The books were distributed periodically to each pair of translators, passing from the first pair to the second, and again from the second to the third in rotation. Point 1 Thus each book was translated 36 times, such is the story which is told. There were also 22 of the apocryphal books. Point 26 When the work was completed, the king took his seat on a lofty throne, and 36 readers sat at his feet 3, having the 36 reproductions of each book, while one held a copy of the Hebrew volume. Then one reader recited and the rest diligently attended, and there was found no discrepancy between the translations, but a marvelous act of God, that it might be known that it was through the possession of the gift of the Holy Spirit that those men agreed in their interpretation. And where they added a word, they all added it in common, and where they omitted, the omission was made by all alike. Of the omitted portions there is no need, but of the additions there is need. 9 We must now sketch the plot of the story which is told. A knowledge of these matters will be profitable to thee. The narrative here attempted 5 will indicate who each translator 6 was and whence he came, his date and nationality, and the reason why he became a translator. The first to translate this same 7 Holy Scripture from one text amended. 1 Contrast PII 4 below. Or on low stools. Or of the events of which we have spoken. He proceeds to describe, out of order, and probably from another source, the preliminary events which led up to the translation. Meaning uncertain. The later translators are included as well as LXX. Text uncertain. Appendix 2I Hebrew into Greek were 72 in number, who produced this same one primitive translation under Ptolemy Philadelphus. They were selected from the 12 tribes of Israel, 6 men from each tribe, as Aristeas related in his published work. And their names are as follows: 0/the first, from the tribe of Reubel 2 Hosea, Hezekiah, Zechariah, Jehanan, Hezekiah, Elisha. Of the second, from the tribe of Simeon Judah, Simeon, Samuel, Adai 3 Mattitha, Salma. Of the third, from the tribe of Levi Nehemiah, Joseph, Theodosius, Basa, Ornia, Daki. Of the 4th, from the tribe of Judah Jonathan, Abrai, 4 Elisha, Hananiah, Zechariah, Hilkiah. 5 Of the 5th, from the tribe of Issachar Isaac, Jacob, Jeshua, Sambat, Simeon, Levi. Of the 6th, from the tribe of Zebulun, Judah, Joseph, Simeon, Zechariah, Samuel, Salma. Of the 7th, from the tribe of Gad, Sambat, Zedekiah, Jacob, Isaac, Jesse, Matthew. Of the 8th, from the tribe of Asher, Theodosius, Jason, Jeshua, Theodotus, Jehanan, Jonathan. Of the 9th, from the tribe of Dan, Theophilus, Abram, Arsam, Jason, and Mea Daniel. One text uncertain. Another form of Reuben used by Josephus, Rubelos. 3 or Adi. Or Abri. 0 This name has dropped out of T.11 The Aristeas manuscripts II Appendix of the 10th, from the tribe of Naphtali, Jeremiah, Eliezer, Zechariah, Banya, Elisha, Dathai.1 of the 11th, from the tribe of Joseph Samuel, Josephus, Judah, Jonathan, Caleb, Dositheus. Of the 12th, from the tribe of Benjamin Isaelis, Johanan, Theodosius, Arsam, Avitus to Ezekiel. These are the names of the 72 translators before mentioned d. Now the successor of the first Ptolemy and the second of the kings of Alexandria was, as we said, Ptolemy surnamed Philadelphus. He was a lover of all that is beautiful and of literature, and built a library in that same city of Alexander in the Bruttium so-called, now an uninhabited district in the said city, which he placed under the charge of one Demetrius the Phalerine. Him he bade collect the books in existence in every quarter of the world, and he wrote letters importuning every king and governor on earth to send ungrudgingly the books, that were within his realm or government, I mean the works of poets and prose writers, orators 3 and sophists, physicians, professors of medicine, historians, and so on. One day, when the business was proceeding apace and the books were being assembled from all quarters, the king asked his librarian how many volumes had, already, been collected in th library. He made answer to the king and said, there are already 54,800, more or less. But I hear that there is still a great mass of writings in the world, among the Ethiopians and Indians, the Persians and Elamites and Babylonians, the Assyrians and Chaldeans, 1 or Dathai. 3 or rhetoricians. 2 or abatis. 4 grwe. Appendix 113 Among the Romans also and the Phoenicians, the Syrians, and the Romans, 1 in Hellas. They were not as yet called Romans but Latins. There are, moreover, with them of Jerusalem and Judea certain divine books of the prophets, which tell of God and the creation of the world and contain all other teaching that is for the general good. Wherefore, 0 King, if it is thy majesty's pleasure to send for these also, do thou write to the doctors in Jerusalem, and they will send them to thee, that so thou mayest lay up the self-same books in the self-same library of thy reverence. Thereupon the king wrote a letter as follows: King Ptolemy to the doctors of the Jews in Jerusalem, many greetings. I have built a library and collected a multitude of books from each nation and stored them therein. And hearing that with you also there are current 2 certain books of prophets which tell of God and the creation of the world, and being earnestly desirous to consecrate them with the rest, I am writing to bid you send these to us. That my earnest desire in such a suit is prompted not by idle curiosity or malice but by a regard for their honor, and that this request of mine is made to shew my good faith and friendship towards you, you will recognize if you call to mind the benevolence which we shewed to you, on a former occasion. You remember, I ween, how that, when many had been taken captives from your country and had been brought into our country of Egypt, I them go and dismissed them free, with abundance of supplies, alter taking thought for them with no ordinary care, insomuch that I healed those among them who were one added in the Syriac text, with this reading Hellas apparentur, stands for Magna Graecia. The Greek has in them of Hellas. 2 or and hearing a report that there are with you also. HII 4 appendix stricken and, likewise, let them go, and the naked did I clothe. And now too I am sending a golden table adorned with the most costly precious stones, of 100 talents weight, in the room of the table that was taken from the holy place at Jerusalem, with gifts and votive treasures won for the sacred place. I have recounted these things that ye may know that it is with pious aspiration too that I ask for the books. So the letter was dispatched and the gifts, likewise. And they, when they received the letter, and read it, and beheld the gifts, were filled with exceeding great joy. And without delay they had transcribed in Hebrew characters of gold the books which I have already enumerated, 22 canonical and 72 apocryphal, and sent them off. The king on receiving them looked into them and, being unable to read what was written in Hebrew characters and in the Hebrew tongue, was constrained to write a second letter to them and to ask for interpreters capable of rendering for him the Hebrew into Greek. The contents of the letter were as follows: 1. King Ptolemy to the doctors of piety that are in J. Salem, many greetings. Treasure that is hid in a fountain that is sealed, what profit is in these twain? For even so are the contents of the books which ye have sent us. 4. Since we are unable to read what ye have sent us, it profiteth us nothing. Deign then to send us interpreters, such, among you, as, from early youth, have been accurately trained in the languages of both Hebrews and Greeks. 1. Or heirlooms. 2. Or in accordance with a vow of piety. Contrast P1RO above. Iclas. XX30 with CANT 4. 12 LXX. Text uncertain. Appendix II5. Then the doctors of the Hebrews selected and sent the 72 translators, before mentioned, following the example of what Moses did aforetime, when he went up into the mount by command of the Lord and heard Flu Tien Jung Khan, take with thee 70 men and go up into the mount. 1. But this man too to preserve peace between the tribes, lest, if he took 5 men from some and 6 from others, he should create faction among them, devised rather to take 72 and to add to the number. In the self-same manner then, as I said, they dispatched these men also, who translated the books in the Pharian islands so called, as we have related above. And so the books were rendered into Greek and deposited in the first library which was built in the Bruchium. After a reference to the daughter library in the Syracuse and the succession of the Ptolemies, the Syriac adds, it was in the days of Ptolemy Philadelphus, in his 7th year, more or less, that the aforesaid 72 interpreters translated the books. 17. Jerome. A. Preface to the Pentateuch. I know not who was the first lying author to construct the 70 cells at Alexandria, in which they were separated and yet all wrote the same words, whereas Aristeas, one of the bodyguard 3 of the said Ptolemy, and long after him Josephus have said nothing of the sort, but write that they were assembled in a single hall 1 and conferred together 5, not that they prophesied. For 1 Exodus XXIV. 1. Paraphrased. Or he, i.e. the chief rabbi. Jerome uses the Greek word hyper as, ists. Lat Basilica GCFR height. 302, II6 Appendix. It is one thing to be a prophet, another to be an interpreter. B. Commentary on Ezekiel, 2. 5, Ezek v. 12. Yet Aristeas and Josephus and the whole Jewish school assert that only the 5 books of Moses were translated by the 70. Notwithstanding Jerome's sane criticism above, not many years later Augustine, in his De Civitate Dei, 1842, is found repeating the legend of the separate cells and the miraculous consensus of the inspired translators. He adds one noteworthy remark, viz. that the custom has now become prevalent of calling their translation the Septuagint. List of the Ptolemies BC. Ptolemy I, Soter 305-285. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus 285-247. Ptolemy III, Euergetes 247-222. Ptolemy IV, Philopater 222-205. 1 Ptolemy V, Epiphanes 205-182. Ptolemy VI, Onpater 182. Ptolemy VII, Philometer 182-146. Ptolemy VII I, Philopater and Eos 146 Ptolemy 9, Ur gets 2, or L. Hiskin 146 to 117 Phi Cleopatra 3 and her sons Ptolemy X, Philometer 2 or Soter 2 or Lathyrus, and 117 to 81 Ptolemy 11, Alexander Berenike 3 and Ptolemy 12, Alexander 281 Ptolemy 13, Auletes 81 to 52 Cleopatra 6. Her brothers Ptolemy X Lee and Ptolemy 15 and her son Caesarion 5 I30 note on page 90, 7, contributed by Canon Box. There seems to be a mixed /le here of older and later Halakote, t. It seems to me that in its original form the passage referred merely to script, not to language. In this case, nor in the Median language nor in Greek will be a later addition, unless these words refer to script. It is interesting to notice that in any tongue is omitted in the best texts. Thus in its original form it would have run probably the law must not be written in ordinary, old, Hebrew script nor in Aramaic, Syriac, script nor in the Median, vi Elamitic, language nor in the Greek language. A copy written in any foreign tongue or in any foreign characters, reading C/:UI, shall not be used in the service, but only one written in the Assyrian characters. It is curious to note that in Megillah 1:8a a reference is made to the Book of Esther being read in Elamitic. Printed LNGUTAT Britain. By RLCHARD Clay and Sons, Limited, Brunswick ST1 Stampo RDST, 1 SB11 and Bungay, Suffolk.